Chapter 21 of The Red Room by August Strindberg. Translated by Ellie Schlesner. Recording by William Peck. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21 A Soul Overboard. Rehnhjelm awoke on the following morning at 4 o'clock. Somebody had called his name. He sat up in bed and listened. There was not a sound. He drew up the blind and looked out on a grey autumn morning, windy and rainy. He went back to bed and tried to sleep, but in vain. There were strange voices in the wind. They moaned and warned and wept and whimpered. He tried to think of something pleasant, of his happiness. He took his part and began to learn it. It seemed to be nothing but, "Yes, my prince." He thought of Falander's words and could not help admitting he was to some extent right. He tried to picture himself on the stage as Horatio. He tried to picture Agnes in the part of Ophelia, and he could see in her nothing but a hypocritical schemer, spreading nets for Hamlet at Polonius's advice. He attempted to drive away the thought, and instead of Agnes he saw the coquettish Miss Jacquette, who had been the last to play the part at the Municipal Theatre. He tried in vain to drive away these disagreeable fancies. They followed him like gnats. At last, exhausted with the strain, he fell asleep, but only to suffer the same torment in his dream. He roused himself with an effort, but soon dropped off to sleep again, and immediately the same visions disturbed him. About 9 o'clock he awoke with a scream, and jumped out of bed as if he were fleeing from evil spirits. When he looked into the glass he saw that his eyes were red with weeping. He dressed hastily, and as he picked up his boot, a big spider ran across the floor. The sight pleased him, for he believed in the superstition that a spider is a harbinger of happiness. His good humour was restored, and he came to the conclusion that if a man wanted an undisturbed night's rest, he should avoid crabs for supper. He drank his coffee and smoked a pipe and smiled at the rain showers and the wind. A knock at the door aroused him from his reverie. He started, for he was afraid of news. He could not tell why, but he thought of the spider and calmly opened the door. A servant handed him a letter from Falander, begging him to come to his rooms at 10, on very important business. Again he was assailed by the indescribable feeling of fear which had troubled his morning slumber. He tried to while away the time until 10. It was impossible. He dressed and went to Falander's house. The latter had risen early, his room had been put straight, and he was ready to receive his friend. He greeted Rehnhjelm cordially, but with unusual gravity. Rehnhjelm overwhelmed him with questions, but Falander refused to reply before 10 o'clock. Rehnhjelm's anxiety grew, and he wanted to know whether there was unpleasant news. Falander replied that nothing on earth was as unpleasant as long as one looked at things in the right light, and he declared that many so-called unbearable situations could be borne quite easily if only one did not exaggerate their importance. The time passed slowly, but at last it struck 10. A gentle, double rap at the door relieved the tension. Falander opened at once and admitted Agnes. Without a look at those present, she drew the key from the lock and locked the door from the inside. A momentary embarrassment seized her when, on turning around, she was confronted by 2 men instead of only 1, but her embarrassment gave way to pleasant surprise when she recognized Rehnhjelm. Throwing off her waterproof, she ran towards him. He took her in his arms and passionately pressed her to his heart, as if he had not seen her for a year. "You have been away a long time, Agnes." "A long time? What do you mean? I feel as if I hadn't seen you for a lifetime. How splendid you are looking! Did you sleep well? Do you think I look better than usual?" "Yes, you are flushed and there are little dimples on your cheeks. Won't you say good morning to Falander?" The latter stood quietly listening to the conversation, but his face was deadly white, and he seemed to be absorbed in thought. "How worn you are looking," said Agnes, crossing the room with the graceful movements of a kitten, as Rehnhjelm released her from his arms. Falander made no reply. Agnes looked at him more keenly, and all at once became aware of his thoughts. A fleeting expression of trouble passed across her face, as the surface of a pond is rippled by the breeze. But she immediately regained her usual serenity, glanced at Rehnhjelm, realized the situation, and was prepared for anything. "May we be told what important business has brought us together here, at this early hour?" she asked gaily, putting her hand on Falander's shoulder. "Certainly," said the latter with such firm resolution that her face paled, but at the same moment he threw back his head, as if he wanted to force his thoughts into another groove. "It's my birthday, and I want you to have breakfast with me." Agnes, who had seen the train rushing straight at her, felt relieved. She burst into merry laughter and embraced Falander. "But as breakfast has been ordered for 11, we'll have to wait a while. Won't you sit down?" There was an ominous silence. "An angel is passing through the room," said Agnes. "You!" said Rehnhjelm, respectfully and ardently kissing her hand. Falander looked as if he had been thrown out of his saddle, and was making violent efforts to regain it. "I saw a spider this morning," said Rehnhjelm, "that predicts happiness." "Regne matin chagrin," said Falander. "Have you never heard of that?" "What does that mean?" asked Agnes. "A spider on the morrow, grief and sorrow." Again they grew silent. The only sound which disturbed the stillness was the sound of the rain beating in gusts against the windows. "I read an awfully tragic book last night," remarked Falander. "I hardly slept a wink." "What book was that?" asked Rehnhjelm, without betraying very much interest. "Its title was Pierre Clément, and its subject the usual woman's game, but it was told so well that it made a great impression on me." "May I ask what the usual woman's game is?" said Agnes. "Faithfulness and treachery." "And this Pierre Clément?" "He was of course betrayed. He was a young artist, in love with another man's mistress." "I remember the book. I liked it very much. Wasn't she later on engaged to a man whom she really loved? Yes, that was it. And during all the time she kept up her old liaison. The author wanted to show that a woman can love in two ways, a man only in one. That's true enough, isn't it?" "Certainly. But the day came when her fiancé was going to compete with a picture. To cut my tale short, she gave herself to the president, and Pierre Clément was happy and could be married." "And by this the author wanted to show that a woman will sacrifice everything to the man she loves. A man, on the other hand..."
"That is the most infamous statement I ever heard," burst out Falander.
He rose, went to his writing desk, threw open the flap and took out a black box.
"Here,"
he said, handing it to Agnes. "Go home and rid the world of a monster."
"What's that?"
laughed Agnes, opening the box and taking out a 6-barreled revolver.
"I say, what a sweet thing! Didn't you use this as Karl Moor? I believe it is loaded."
She raised the revolver and fired up the chimney.
"Lock it up," she said. "This is no toy, my friends."
Rehnhjelm had watched the scene speechlessly. He understood the meaning well enough, but he was unable to say a word, and he was so much under the girl's spell that he could not even feel angry with her. He realized that he had been stabbed, but he had as yet not had time to feel the pain. The girl's impudence disconcerted Falander. He wanted time to recover. His moral execution had been a complete failure, and his coup de théâtre had been disastrous to himself.
"Hadn't we better go now?"
asked Agnes, straightening her hat before the glass. Falander opened the door.
"Go and be damned to you," he said. "You have ruined an honest man's peace of mind."
"What are you talking about? Shut the door! It's none too warm here."
"I see. I have to speak more plainly. Where were you last night?"
"Hjalmar knows, and it's no business of yours."
"You were not at your aunt's. You had supper with the manager."
"It's a lie."
"I saw you at 9 in the vaults of the town hall."
"I say it's a lie. I was at home at the time. Go and ask Aunt's maid, who saw me home."
"I should never have expected this from you."
"Hadn't we better stop talking nonsense now and be off? You shouldn't read stupid books all night. Then you wouldn't be in a bad temper on the next day. Put on your hats and come."
Rehnhjelm put his hand to his head to feel whether it was in its accustomed place, for everything seemed to him to be turned upside down. When he found that it was still there, he attempted to come to a clear understanding of the matter, but he was unable to do so.
"Where were you on the 6th of July?"
asked Falander with the sternness of a judge.
"What an idiotic question to ask! How can I remember what happened 3 months ago?"
"You were with me, but you told Hjalmar you were with your aunt."
"Don't listen to him,"
said Agnes, going up to Rehnhjelm and caressing him.
"He's talking nonsense."
Rehnhjelm's hand shot out. He seized her by the throat and flung her on her back behind the stove, where she fell in a little pile of wood and remained lying, still and motionless. He put on his hat, but Falander had to help him with his coat, for he trembled violently.
"Come along, let's be off,"
he said, spitting on the hearthstone. Falander hesitated for a moment, felt Agnes's pulse, and then followed Rehnhjelm, with whom he caught up in the lower hall. "I admire you," he said. "The matter was really beyond discussion."
"Then let it for ever remain so. We haven't much time to enjoy each other's company. I am leaving for home by the next train, to work and to forget. Let's go to the vaults now."
They went to the vaults and engaged a private room, where breakfast was served to them.
"Has my hair turned grey?" asked Rehnhjelm, passing his hand over his hair, which was damp and clung closely to his skull.
No, old man, that doesn't often happen. Even I'm not grey.
Is she hurt?
No.
It was in this room I met her for the first time. He rose from the table, staggered to the sofa, and threw himself on his knees by the side of it. Burying his head in the cushions, he burst into tears like a child crying in his mother's lap. Falander took his head in both his hands, and Rehnhjelm felt something hot and scalding dropping on his neck. "Where's your philosophy now, old fellow? Out with it! I'm drowning! Give me a straw to clutch at!"
Poor boy! Poor old boy!
"I must see her. I must ask her forgiveness. I love her in spite of it. Are you sure she isn't hurt? Oh, my God, that one can be so unhappy and yet not die!" At 3:00 in the afternoon, Rehnhjelm left for Stockholm. Falander slammed the carriage door behind him and turned the handle. Chapter 22. of The Red Room by August Strindberg. Translated by Ellie Schlesinger. Recording by William Peck. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22. Hard Times. To Sellén, the autumn had brought great changes. His powerful patron had died, and all memory of him was to be blotted out. Even the memories of his kind actions were not to survive him. That Sellén's stipend was stopped went without saying, especially as the artist could not bring himself to petition for its continuance. He did not believe that he required further assistance, after having been given a helping hand once, and moreover there were so many younger members of his profession in greater need of it. But he was made to realize that not only was the sun extinguished, but that the smaller planets too suffered from total eclipse. He had worked strenuously during the summer, and had made great progress in his art. But nevertheless the president declared that it had deteriorated, and that his success in the spring had been nothing more than a stroke of luck. The professor of landscape painting had told him as a friend that he would never be a great artist, and the academician had seized the opportunity to rehabilitate himself, and clung to his first opinion. In addition to this, the public taste in pictures had changed. The ignorant, wealthy handful of people who were in the habit of buying pictures and therefore set the fashion did not want landscapes, but portraits of the watering places and summer resorts they knew, and it was difficult to sell even these. The only demand was for sentimental genre pictures and half-nude figures. Therefore Sellén had fallen on evil days, for he could not bring himself to paint against his better judgment. He was now renting a former photographic studio on the top of a house in Government Street. The accommodation consisted of the studio itself, with its rotten floor and leaking roof. The latter defect was not felt at present, for it was winter and the roof was covered with snow. And the old dark room, which smelled of collodium, and for this reason could only be used as a winter-cold shed, when circumstances permitted the purchase of fuel. The only piece of furniture was a wooden garden seat, studded with protruding nails. It was so short that a man using it as a bed, and it was always used as a bed when the owner, or rather the borrower, spent the night at home, had either to draw his knees up to his chin, or allow his legs to dangle over the side. The bedding consisted of half a rug, the other half was at the pawnbroker's, and a leather case, stuffed to bursting point with studies and sketches. In the dark room was a water tap and a basin with a waste pipe, the only substitute for a dressing table. On a cold afternoon, a short time before Christmas, Sellén was standing before his easel, painting for the third time a new picture on an old canvas. He had just risen from his hard bed. No servant had come in to light his fire, partly because he had no servant, and partly because he had nothing with which to make a fire. No servant had brushed his clothes or brought his coffee. And yet he was standing before his easel, whistling merrily, engaged in painting a brilliant sunset, when there came 4 knocks at the door. Sellén opened without hesitation and admitted Ollie Montanus, very plainly and very lightly clad, without an overcoat. "Good morning, Ollie. How are you? Did you sleep well?"
"Thanks."
"How's the cash box?"
"Oh, bad.
"And the notes?"
There are so few in circulation."
"I see. They won't issue any more? And the valuables?"
"There aren't any."
"Do you think it's going to be a hard winter?"
"I saw a great many chatterers this morning. That means a hard winter."
"You took a morning stroll?"
"I've walked about all night, after leaving the Red Room at midnight."
You were at the Red Room last night?
Yes, and I made 2 new acquaintances, Dr. Borg and a man called Levin.
Oh, those rascals. I know them. Why didn't you spend the night with them?
They turned up their noses at me because I had no overcoat, and I felt ashamed. But I am worn out. I'll rest for a few moments on your sofa. I've walked through the whole town and round half of it. I must try and get work today at a stonemason's or I shall starve.
Is it true that you are a member of the Workmen's Union, Star of the North?
Quite true. I'm going to lecture there on Sunday next, on Sweden.
A good subject. Plenty to say.
If I should fall asleep on your sofa, don't waken me. I'm dead beat.
All right, old chap. Go to sleep.
A few moments later, Ollie was fast asleep and snoring loudly. His head was hanging over one of the side railings which supported his thick neck, and his legs over the other.
Poor devil,
muttered Sellén, covering him up with his rug. There was another knock, but as it was unfamiliar, Sellén judged it wise to take no notice of it. Thereupon the clamour became so furious that it dissipated his apprehensions, and he opened the door to Dr. Borg and Levin. Borg was the first to speak.
Is Falk here?
No.
Who's that sack of wood over there?
Continued Borg, pointing at Ollie with his snow boot.
Ollie Montanus.
Oh, that extraordinary fellow who was with Falk last night. Is he asleep?
Yes.
Did he spend the night here?
Yes.
Why haven't you a fire? It's beastly cold.
Because I have no wood.
Send for some then. Where's the servant? I'll make her trot.
Gone to early service.
Wake up that sleeping ox over there and send him.
No, let him sleep,
objected Sellén, covering up Ollie, who was still snoring loudly.
Then I must show you another way. What's the floor packing? Earth or rubbish?
I don't understand these matters,
replied Sellén, carefully stepping on some sheets of cardboard which were lying on the floor.
Have you got another piece of cardboard?
What are you driving at?
asked Sellén, colouring up to the roots of his hair.
I want it and a pair of fire tongs.
Sellén gave him the required articles, took his sketching stool and sat down on the pieces of cardboard as if he were guarding a treasure. Borg took off his coat and with the help of the fire tongs loosened a board on the floor, rotted by rain and acids.
Confound you! What are you doing?
exclaimed Sellén.
I used to do this in my college days at Uppsala,
said Borg.
But you can't do that sort of thing at Stockholm.
Hang it all, I'm cold. I must have a fire.
But there's no necessity to break up the floor in the middle of the room. It shows too much.
What does that matter to me? I don't live here, but this is too hard.
Meanwhile he had approached Sellén, and all of a sudden he pushed him and the stool over. In falling, the artist dragged the pieces of cardboard with him, exposing the bare floor packing underneath.
Miscreant! To have a perfect timber yard and not to say a word about it?
The rain's done it.
I don't care who's done it. Let's light a fire.
He wrenched off a few pieces of wood with his strong hands, and soon a fire was blazing in the grate. Levin had watched the scene, quiet, neutral and polite. Borg sat down before the fire and made the tongs red hot. Again there was a knock, 3 short raps and a longer one.
That's Falk,
said Sellén, opening the door. Falk entered, looking a little hectic.
Do you want money?
said Borg to the newcomer, laying his hand on his breast pocket.
What a question to ask,
said Falk, looking at him doubtfully.
How much do you want? I can let you have it.
Are you serious?
asked Falk, and his face cleared.
Serious? How much? The figure, the amount.
I could do with, say, 60 crowns.
Good Lord, how modest you are,
remarked Borg, and turned to Levin.
Yes, it is very little, said the latter. Take as much as you can get, Falk, while the purse is open.
I'd rather not. 60 crowns is all I want, and I can't afford to take up a bigger loan. But how is it to be paid back?
12 crowns every 6 months, 24 crowns per annum, in 2 installments,
said Levin promptly and firmly.
Those are easy terms, replied Falk. Where do you get money on those terms?
From the Wheelwrights' Bank. Give me paper and pen, Levin.
Quick as lightning, Levin produced a promissory note, a pen and a pocket inkstand. The note had already been filled up by the others. When Falk saw the figure 800, he hesitated for a moment.
800 crowns?
he asked.
You can have more if you're not satisfied.
No, I won't. It's all the same who takes the money as long as it is paid up all right. But can you raise money on a bill of this sort without security?
Without security? You are forgetting that we are guaranteeing it,
replied Levin, with contemptuous familiarity.
I don't want to depreciate it,
observed Falk.
I'm grateful for your guarantees, but I don't believe that the bill will be accepted.
Oh, won't it? It's accepted already,
said Borg, bringing out a bill of acceptance,
as he called it. Go on, Falk, sign. Falk signed his name. Bork and Levin were watching him, looking over his shoulders like policemen. Assessor, dictated Borg.
No, I'm a journalist, objected Falk.
That's no good. You are registered as assessor, and as such you still figure in the directory.
Did you look it up?
One should be correct in matters of form, said Borg gravely. Falk signed. Come here, Sellén, and witness, commanded Borg.
I don't know whether I ought to, replied Sellén. I've seen at home, in the country, so much misery arising from signatures.
You are not in the country now, and you are not dealing with peasants. There's no reason why you shouldn't witness that Falk's signature is genuine. Sellén signed, shaking his head. And now rouse that drought ox over there and make him too witness the signature. When all shaking was in vain, Borg took the tongs, which were now red hot, and held them under the sleeper's nostrils. Wake up, you dog, and you shall have something to eat. Olle jumped up and rubbed his eyes. You are to witness Falk's signature. Do you understand? Olle took the pen and wrote his name in obedience to the two guarantors' dictation. When he had done so, he turned the bench to lie down again, but Borg prevented him. But wait a minute, he said. Falk must sign a counter-guarantee.
Don't do it, Falk,
said Olle.
It'll end badly. There'll be trouble.
Silence, you dog, bellowed Borg. Come here, Falk. We just guaranteed your bill, as you know. All we want now from you is a counter-guarantee in place of Struve's, against whom an action has been brought.
What do you mean by a counter-guarantee?
It's only a matter of form. The loan was for 800 crowns on the painter's bank. The first payment has been made, but now that Struve has been proceeded against, we must find a substitute. It's a safe old loan, and there are no risks. The money was due a year ago. Falk signed, and the other two witnessed. Borg carefully folded the bills and gave them to Levin, who immediately turned to go. I'll give you an hour, said Borg. If you are not back with the money by then, I'll set the police on your track. And satisfied with his morning's work, he stretched himself out on the seat on which Olle had been lying. The latter staggered to the fire, lay down on the floor, and curled himself up like a dog. For a little while nobody spoke.
I say, Olle, said Sellén presently, breaking the silence, supposing we signed a bill of this sort?
You would be sent to Rindo, said Borg.
What is Rindo? asked Sellén.
A convict prison in the Skerries, but in case the gentlemen should prefer Lake of Malar, there's a prison there called Longholm.
But seriously, said Falk, what happens if one can't pay on a day when the money falls due?
One takes up a fresh loan at the Tailor's Bank, for instance, replied Borg.
Why don't you go to the Imperial Bank? questioned Falk.
Because it's rotten, answered Borg.
Can you make head or tail out of all this? said Sellén to Olle.
I don't understand a word of it,
answered the latter. You will when you are members of the Academy and your names appear in the directory.
End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Red Room by August Strindberg. Translated by Ellie Schlesinger. Recording by William Peck. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23. Audiences. Nicholas Falk was sitting in his office. It was the morning of the day before Christmas Eve. He was a little changed. Time had thinned his fair hair, and the passions had delved little channels in his face, for the acids which the parched soil distilled. He was stooping over a little book of the shape and size of the Catechism, and his busy pen seemed to prick out designs. There was a knock at the door. Immediately the book disappeared beneath the flap of his writing desk, and was replaced by the morning paper. Falk was absorbed in its perusal when his wife entered. Take a seat, he said politely. No, thank you. I'm in a hurry. Have you read the morning paper?
No.
But you are reading it at this very minute.
I've only just taken it up.
Have you seen the review of Arvid's poems?
Yes.
Well, they were much praised.
He wrote the review himself.
You said the same thing last night, when you were reading The Grey Bonnet.
What have you come here for?
I've just met the Admiral's wife. She's accepted our invitation and said she would be delighted to meet the young poet.
Did she really?
She did, indeed.
Of course it's possible to make a mistake, although I don't admit that I made one. I suppose you're again wanting money.
Again? How long ago is it since you gave me any?
Here you are, then. But now go, and don't bother me again before Christmas. You know it's been a bad year. Indeed, I don't know that at all. Everybody says it's been a splendid year.
For the agriculturists, yes, but not for the insurance societies. Run away now."
Mrs. Falk went, making way for Fritz Levin, who entered cautiously, as if he were afraid of a trap.
"What have you come for?"
asked Falk. "Oh, I just wanted to wish you a good morning in passing."
"A good idea. I've been wanting to see you."
"Have you really?"
"You know young Levi?"
"Of course I do."
"Read this paper aloud, please."
Levin read in a loud voice. "Magnificent bequest, with a generosity which is not now infrequently met with among the merchant class, the wholesale merchant Mr. Charles Nicholas Falk, in order to commemorate the anniversary of a happy marriage, has bequeathed to the crèche Bethlehem the sum of 20,000 crowns, one half of it to be paid at once, and the other half after the death of the generous donor. The bequest is all the more significant as Mrs. Falk is one of the founders of the philanthropic institution."
"Will that do?"
asked Falk. "Splendidly. The new year will bring you the Order of Vasa.
I want you to take the deed of gift and the money to the administrative committee of the crèche, that is to say, to my wife, and then go and find young Levi. You understand?"
"Quite."
Falk gave him the deed of gift, written on parchment, and the amount. "Count the money to see whether it is right."
Levin opened the packet of papers and stared, wide-eyed, at the 50 sheets covered with lithographic designs in all possible colours. "Is that money?" he asked.
"These are securities," answered Falk. 50 shares at 200 crowns each, in the Triton, which I bequeath to the crèche Bethlehem."
"Ha! It's all over with the Triton then, and the rats are leaving the sinking ship?"
"I didn't say that," replied Falk, laughing maliciously.
"But if it should be the case, the crèche will be bankrupt."
"That doesn't concern me, and it concerns you even less. But there is something else I want you to do. You must, you know what I mean when I say you must."
I know, bailiffs, promissory notes, go on."
"You must induce Arvid to come here to dinner on Bank Holiday."
"It will be about as easy as bringing you 3 hairs out of a giant's beard. Now do you admit that I was wise when I refused to give him your message of last spring? Haven't I always predicted this?"
"Did you? Well, never mind. Hold your tongue and do as you're told. So much for that. There's another thing. I have noticed symptoms of remorse in my wife. She must have met her mother or one of her sisters. Christmas is a sentimental season. Go to my mother-in-law and stir up a little strife."
"A very unpleasant commission."
"Off you go! Next man!"
Levin went. The next visitor was schoolmaster Nyström, who was admitted by a secret door in the background. At his entrance the morning paper was dropped, and the long, narrow book reappeared. Nyström had gone to pieces. His body was reduced to a third of its former size, and his clothes were extremely shabby. He remained humbly standing at the door, took a much-used pocket-book out of his pocket, and waited.
"Ready?"
asked Falk, keeping the place in the book with his first finger.
"Ready,"
replied Nyström, opening the pocket-book.
"Number 26, Lieutenant Kling, 1,500 crowns. Paid?"
"Not paid."
"Prolonged, with extra interest and commission. Call at his private address."
"Never receives at home."
"Threaten him by post with a visit at the barracks." "Number 27, Judge Dahlberg, 800 crowns. Let's see, son of the wholesale merchant Dahlberg, estimated at 35,000. Grant a respite at present, but see that he pays the interest. Keep an eye on him."
"He never pays the interest."
"Send him a postcard to his office. Number 28, Captain Sternburst, 4,000. Good-for-nothing fellow. Paid?"
"Not paid."
"Good instructions. Call on him at noon at the guards' room. Dress, you that is, compromisingly. Your red overcoat with the yellow seams. You know what I mean?"
"No use. I've called on him at the guards' room in the depth of the winter, without any overcoat."
"Then go to his guarantors."
"I've been, and they told me to go to hell. They said that a guarantee was only a matter of form."
"Then call on him on a Wednesday afternoon at 1 o'clock at the offices of the Triton. Take Anderson with you. Then there'll be 2 of you."
"Been done already."
"Has it? How did the directors take it?" asked Falk, rising.
"They were embarrassed."
"Really? Much embarrassed?"
"Much embarrassed."
"And he himself?"
"He took us into the corridor and promised to pay if we never called on him there again."
"Indeed? He spends 2 hours a week there and receives 6,000 crowns, because his name is Sternborst. Let's see, it's Saturday today. Be at the Triton punctually at 12:30. If you should see me there, which I expect you will, not a flicker of an eyelid. Do you understand? Right. Any fresh business?"
35 new requests.
Yes, it's Christmas Eve tomorrow." Falk turned over a bundle of promissory notes. Every now and then he smiled or muttered a word. Good heavens! Has he come to that? And this one? And that one? Who was looked upon as such a steady fellow? Yes. Hard times are in store for all of us. Oh, he too wants money? Then I shall buy his house. Another knock at the door. The desk was closed. Papers and catechism vanished into thin air, and Nyström disappeared through the secret door. At 12:30, whispered Falk as he went. One thing more. Have you finished the poem? Yes, replied a muffled voice. Right. Keep Levin's promissory note in readiness, so that it can be submitted to his head office at any time. Some day I shall smash him. The rascal's deceitful. He arranged his tie, pulled out his cuffs, and opened a door leading to a little waiting room. Ah, good morning, Mr. Lundell. Very glad to see you. Please come in. How are you? I had locked my door for a few moments. It really was Lundell. Lundell dressed in the height of fashion like a shop assistant. He wore a watch chain, rings, gloves, and overshoes. I am not calling at an inconvenient time, I hope. Not at all. Do you think, Mr. Lundell, that you will be able to finish it by tomorrow? Must it be finished by tomorrow? It absolutely must. It will be a red-letter day for the crèche tomorrow. Mrs. Falk will publicly present my portrait to the institution, to be hung in the dining room. Then we must not let any obstacles stand in our way, replied Lundell, taking an easel and an almost finished canvas from a cupboard. If you will sit to me for a few moments, sir, I will give the picture the finishing touches. With all the pleasure in the world. Falk sat down in a chair, crossed his legs, threw himself into the attitude of a statesman, and tried to look aristocratic. Won't you talk, sir? Although your face is an exceedingly interesting one when at rest, yet the more characteristics I can bring out, the better. Falk smirked. A glimmer of pleasure and gratification lit up his coarse features. I hope you'll be able to dine with us on Bank Holiday, Mr. Lundell. Thank you. You'll be able to study the faces of many men of distinction. Then, men whose features deserve being fixed on canvas far more than mine do. Perhaps I may have the honour of painting them. You will, if I recommend you. Oh, do you really think so? Certainly I do. I just caught a new expression in your face. Try and keep it for a few moments. There. This is excellent. I'm afraid I shall have to work at this portrait all day long. There are so many details which one only discovers gradually. Your face is rich in interesting features. In that case we had better dine together. We must see a good deal of each other, Mr. Lundell, so that you may have an opportunity of studying my face for a second edition, which it is always well to have. Really, I must say, there are few people to whom I felt so strongly drawn from the first moment as I did to you, Mr. Lundell. Oh, my dear sir! And let me tell you that my eyes are keen and well able to distinguish truth from flattery. I knew that from the first, answered Lundell unscrupulously. My profession has given me an insight into human character. You are a very keen observer indeed. Not everybody understands me. My wife, for instance. Oh, women cannot be expected. No, that wasn't altogether what I meant. But may I offer you a glass of good old port? Thank you, sir. I never drink when I'm working, on principle. Quite right. I respect this principle. I always respect principles, all the more because I share it. But when I'm not at work, I enjoy a glass. Just as I do. It struck 12:30. Falk rose. Excuse me, I must leave you for a short time on business. I shall be back almost immediately. Certainly. Business first. Falk put on his hat and coat and went. Lundell was left alone. He lit a cigar and studied the portrait. No observer, however keen, could have guessed his thoughts. He had acquired sufficient knowledge of the art of life to hide his opinions, even when he was alone. Nay, more than that, he was afraid of coming to a clear understanding with himself. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of The Red Room by August Strindberg. Translated by Ellie Schlesinger. Recording by William Peck. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24 on Sweden. They had arrived at the dessert. The champagne sparkled in the glasses, which reflected the rays of light from the chandelier in Nicholas Falk's dining room. Arvid was greeted on all sides with friendly handshakes, compliments and congratulations, warnings and advice. Everybody wanted to be present and share in his triumph, for he had had a decided success. Assessor Falk, I'm delighted, said the president of the Board of Payment of Employees' Salaries, nodding to him across the table. I fully appreciate your talent. Arvid
tranquilly pocketed the insulting compliment.
"Why are your poems so melancholy?" asked a young beauty on the poet's right. "One might almost think you were suffering from an unhappy love affair."
"Assessor Falk, allow me to drink to your health," said the chief editor of the Grey Bonnet from the left, stroking his long blond beard. "Why don't you write for my paper?"
"I shouldn't think you would print my articles," replied Arvid.
"I don't see why we shouldn't."
"Our opinions differ so widely."
"Oh, that isn't half as bad as you think. One compromises. We have no opinions." "Your health, Falk!" shouted the excited Lundell from the other side of the table. "Your health!" Levi and Borg had to hold him, otherwise he would have risen and made a speech. It was for the first time that Lundell was invited to a dinner of this sort, and the brilliant assembly and luxurious food and drink intoxicated him. But as all the guests were more or less merry, he fortunately excited no unpleasant attention. Arvid Falk's heart beat faster at the sight of all these people, who had readmitted him to their circle without asking for explanations or apologies. It gave him a sense of security to sit on those old chairs which had been a part of the home of his childhood. With a feeling of melancholy he recognized the tall table centre which, in the old times, had only seen daylight once a year. But the number of new people distracted him. Their friendly faces did not deceive him. Certainly they did not wish him evil, but their friendship depended on a combination of circumstances. Moreover, he saw the whole entertainment in the light of a masquerade. What mutual interest could possibly form a bond between his uncultured brother and Professor Borg, the man with the great scientific reputation? They were shareholders in the same company. What was the proud captain, Gyllenborst, doing here? Had he come for the sake of the dinner? Impossible, even though a man will go a long way for the sake of a good dinner. And the president? The admiral? There must have been invisible ties, strong, unbreakable ties perhaps. The mirth increased, but the laughter was too shrill. The lips were overflowing with wit, but the wit was biting. Falk felt ill at ease. It seemed to him that his father's eyes were looking angrily at the assembly from the painted canvas which hung over the piano. Nicholas Falk beamed with satisfaction. He neither saw nor heard any unpleasantness, but he avoided meeting his brother's eyes as much as possible. They had not spoken to each other yet, for Arvid, in compliance with Levin's instructions, had not arrived till after all the guests had been assembled. The dinner was approaching its end. Nicholas made a speech on the stamina and firm resolution which are necessary to accomplish a man's purpose, the achievement of financial independence and a good social position. "These two qualities," said the speaker, "raise a man's self-respect and endow him with that firmness without which his efforts are unavailing, at any rate, as far as the general good is concerned. And the general welfare, gentlemen, must always be our highest endeavour. I have no doubt that, if the truth were known, it is the ambition of every one here present. I drink to the health of all those who have this day honoured my house, and I hope that I may often in the future enjoy the same privilege." Captain Gyllenborst, who was slightly intoxicated, replied in a lengthy, facetious speech, which, delivered at a different house, before people in a different mood, would have been called scandalous. He abused the commercial spirit which was spreading and declared that he had plenty of self-respect, although he was by no means financially independent. He had been obliged this very morning to settle some business of a most disagreeable nature, but in spite of this he had sufficient strength of character to be present at the banquet, and as far as his social position was concerned, it was second to none. He felt sure that this was everybody's opinion, for otherwise he would not be sitting at this table, the guest of so charming a host. When he had concluded, the party drew a breath of relief.
"It was as if the thundercloud had passed over our heads,"
remarked the beauty, and Arvid Falk heartily agreed.
There was so much humbug, so much deceit in the atmosphere, that Arvid longed to take his leave. These people, who appeared so honest and respectable, seemed to be held by an invisible chain at which they tore every now and then with suppressed fury. Captain Gyllenborst treated his host with open, though facetious contempt. He smoked a cigar in the drawing-room, generally behaved like a boor, and took no notice whatever of the ladies. He spat in the fireplace, mercilessly criticized oleographs on the walls, and loudly expressed his contempt for the mahogany furniture. The other gentlemen were indifferent. They gave Falk the impression they were on duty. Irritated and upset, he left the party unnoticed. In the street below stood Olle waiting for him.
"I really didn't think you would come,"
said Olle.
It's so beautifully light up there."
"What a reason! I wish you had been there."
"How is Lundell getting on in smart society?"
"Don't envy him. He won't have an easy time if he's going to make his way as a portrait painter. But let's talk of something else. I have been looking for this evening, so as to study the working man at close quarters. It will be like a breath of fresh air after these deadly fumes. I feel as if I were allowed to take a stroll in the wood, after having long been laid up in a hospital. I wonder whether I shall be disillusioned."
"The working man is suspicious. You will have to be careful."
"Is he generous, free from pettiness, or has the pressure which has lain on him for so long spoiled him?"
"You'll be able to see for yourself. Most things in this world differ from our expectations."
"That's true, unfortunately."
Half an hour later they had arrived in the great hall of the Working Men's Union, Star of the North. The place was already crowded. Arvid's black dress coat did not create a good impression. He caught many an unfriendly glance from angry eyes. Olle introduced Arvid to a tall, gaunt man with a face full of passion, who seemed to be troubled with an incessant cough.
"Joiner Eriksson."
"That's me," said the latter. "And is this one of those gentlemen who want to put up for election? He doesn't look big enough for that."
No,
said Olle.
He's here for the newspaper."
"Which newspaper? There are so many different sorts. Perhaps he's come to make fun of us."
No, nothing of the sort,"
said Olle.
"He's a friend, and he'll do all he can for you."
"I see. That alters the matter. But I don't trust those gentlemen. One of them lived with us. That is to say, we lived in the same house in the White Mountains. He was the landlord's agent. Struve was the rascal's name." There was a rap with the hammer. The chair was taken by an elderly man, Wheelwright Löfgren, alderman and holder of the medal Lateris et Artibus. He had held many offices and acquired a great deal of dramatic routine. A certain venerability, capable of quelling storms and silencing noisy meetings, characterized him. His broad face, ornamented by side whiskers and a pair of spectacles, was framed by a judge's wig. The secretary, who sat at his side, was one of the supernumeraries of the great board of functionaries. He wore eyeglasses and expressed with a peasant's grin his dissatisfaction with everything that was said. The front bench was filled by the most aristocratic members of the Union, officers, government officials, wholesale merchants. They supported all loyal resolutions, and with their superior parliamentary skill voted against every attempt at reform. The secretary read the minutes, which the front bench approved. Next, the first item of the agenda was read.
"The preparatory committee would suggest that the Working Men's Union, Star of the North, should express the dissatisfaction which every right-thinking citizen must feel in regard to the unlawful movements which under the name of strikes are spreading nearly all over Europe. Is this the pleasure of the Union?"
Yes, shouted the front bench. "Mr. President," called out the joiner from the White Mountains.
"Who is making so much noise at the back?"
asked the chairman, looking over his spectacles with a face which suggested that he would presently have recourse to the cane. "Nobody is making any noise. I am asking for permission to speak."
"Who is I?"
"Master Joiner Eriksson."
"Are you a master? Since when?"
"I am a journeyman, out of my time. I have never had the means to be made free of the city, but I am every bit as skilful as any other master, and I work on my own account."
"I request the journeyman Joiner Eriksson to sit down and stop interfering. Is it the pleasure of the Union to reply to the question in the affirmative?"
"Mr. Chairman."
"What is the matter?"
"I ask permission to speak. Let me speak," bellowed Eriksson. There was a murmur on the back benches.
Eriksson's turn to speak.
"Journey Eriksson, do you spell your name with an X or a Z?"
asked the chairman, prompted by the secretary. The front bench shook with laughter. "I don't spell, gentlemen, I discuss," said the joiner with blazing eyes. "I discuss, I say. If I had the gift of making speeches, I should show you that the strikers are right. For if masters and principals grow fat because they have nothing to do but to fawn and cringe at levees and similar ceremonies, the working man must pay the piper with his sweat. We know why you won't pay us just wages. It's because we should get the parliamentary vote, and that's what you are afraid of."
"Mr. Chairman." "Captain von Sporn." "Mr. Chairman, gentlemen, it is much to be regretted that at a meeting of this Union, which has a reputation for dignified conduct, last displayed at the royal wedding, people without the smallest trace of parliamentary tact should be permitted to compromise a respectable society by a shameless and reckless contempt of all seemliness. Believe me, gentlemen, such a thing could never have happened in a country where from early youth military discipline,
conscription, said Eriksson to Ollie,
had been the rule, where the habit of controlling oneself and others had been acquired. I believe I am expressing the general feeling of the meeting when I say that I hope that such a distressing scene may never again occur amongst us. I say us, for I too am a working man. We all are in the sight of the Eternal, and I say it as a member of this union. The day would be a day of mourning when I should find myself compelled to withdraw the words which I recently uttered at another meeting. It was at the meeting of the National League of Promoters of Conscriptions. The words, I have a high opinion of the Swedish working man.
Hear, 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 shouted the crowd.
Does the meeting accept the suggestion of the preparatory committee?
Yes, yes, shouted the crowd.
Second item, at the instigation of several members of the union, the preparatory committee submit to the meeting the proposal to collect a sum not exceeding 3,000 crowns, as a testimonial to the Duke of Dalsland at his forthcoming confirmation. The gift to be an expression of the gratitude of the working man to the royal family, and more especially of his disapproval of those working men's disturbances under which the name of Commune devastated the French capital.
Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Haberfield.
No, it's I, Eriksson. I ask permission to say a few words.
Oh, well, Eriksson has permission to speak.
I merely want to point out that not the working man, but officials, lawyers, officers, conscripts, and journalists were to blame for the Commune at Paris. If I had the gift of making speeches, I should ask those gentlemen to express their ideas in an album of confessions.
Does the meeting agree with the proposal?
Yes, yes, shouted the crowd, and the clerks began to write and to check and to chatter, exactly as they had done at the parliamentary meetings.
Are things always managed in this way?
asked Falk. Don't you think it's amusing, sir? said Eriksson. It's enough to turn one's hair grey. I call it corruption and treachery. Nothing but meanness and selfishness. There isn't a man amongst them who has the cause really at heart, and therefore the things which must happen will happen.
What things?
We'll see, said the joiner, taking Ollie's hand. Are you ready? Hold your own ground. You'll be sharply criticized. Ollie nodded slyly. Stonemason, journeyman. Ollie Montanus has announced a lecture on Sweden. The subject is a big one, but if he will promise not to exceed half an hour, we will hear what he has got to say. What do you say, gentlemen? Hear, hear, shouted the crowd. If you please, Mr. Montanus. Ollie shook himself like a dog about to jump, and threaded his way through the assembly, who examined him with curious eyes. The chairman began a brief conversation with the front bench, and the secretary yawned before taking up a newspaper to show the meeting that he, for one, was not going to listen. Ollie stepped on the platform, lowered his heavy eyelids, and moved his jaws, pretending to be speaking. When the room had grown really silent, so silent that everybody could hear what the chairman said to the captain, he began.
On Sweden, some points of view.
And after a pause,
Gentlemen, it might be more than an unfounded supposition to say that the most productive idea and the most vigorous striving of our times is the suppression of short-sighted patriotism, which divides nations and pits them against one another as foes. We have seen the means used to gain this object, namely, international exhibitions and their results, honorary diplomas.
The audience looked puzzled. What's he driving at? said Eriksson. It's rather unexpected, but it sounds all right.
Now, as in the past, Sweden marches at the head of civilization. She has more than any other nation spread the cosmopolitan ideal, and if one may rely on statistics, she has attained a great deal. Exceptionally favorable circumstances have contributed to this result. I will examine them shortly, and then pass on to lighter subjects, such as the form of government, the ground tax, and so on.
It's going to be rather long, said Eriksson, nudging Arvid, but he's an amusing chap.
Sweden, as everybody knows, was originally a German colony, and the Swedish language, which has been preserved fairly pure to our days, is neither more nor less than Low German and its 12 dialects. This circumstance, I mean this difficulty of communicating with one another, experienced by the provinces, has been a powerful factor in counteracting the development of that unhealthy national feeling. Other fortunate facts have opposed a one-sided German influence, which has reached its pinnacle when Sweden became a German province under Albrecht of Mecklenburg. The foremost of these facts is the conquest of the Danish provinces, Scania, Holland, Bleking, Bohuslän, and Dalsland. Sweden's richest provinces are inhabited by Danes who speak the language of their country and refuse to acknowledge the Swedish rule.
What in the name of fortune is he getting at? Is he mad?
The inhabitants of Scania, for instance, to this day look upon Copenhagen as their capital and constitute the opposition in the parliament. The same thing applies to the Danish Göteborg, which does not acknowledge Stockholm as the capital of the realm. An English settlement has sprung up there, and English influence is predominant. These people, the English people, fish in the waters near the coast, and during the winter very nearly all the wholesale trade is in their hands. They return to their own country in the summer and enjoy their winter profits in the villas in the Scotch Highlands. Very excellent people, though. They have even their own newspaper, in which they command their own actions without, it must be admitted, blaming those of others. Immigration is another factor of the utmost importance. We have the Finns in the Finnish forests, but we also have them in the capital, where they took refuge when the political situation drove them out of their own country. In all our more important ironworks you will find a fair number of Walloons. They came over in the 17th century, and to this day speak their broken French. You all know that we owe the new Swedish constitution to a Walloon. Capable people, these Walloons, and very honest.
What in the name of heaven does it all mean?
In the reign of King Gustavus Adolphus, a whole cargo of Scotch scum landed on our coast and took service in the army. They eventually forced their way into the House of Knights. At the East Coast there are many families who cherish traditions of their immigration from Livland and other Slavonic provinces, and so it is not surprising that we frequently meet here pure Tartar types. I maintain that the Swedish nation is fast becoming denationalized. Open a book on heraldry and count the Swedish names. If they exceed 25%, you may cut off my nose, gentlemen. Open the directory at random. I counted the letter G, and of the 400 names, 200 were foreign. What is the cause of this? There are many causes, but the principal ones are the foreign dynasties and the wars of conquest. If one thinks of the scum that has sat on the Swedish throne at one time or another, one cannot help marveling that the nation is so loyal to the king. The constitutional law that the kings of Sweden shall be foreigners is bound to be of greatest assistance in the work of denationalization. This has been proved to be a fact. I am convinced that the country will gain by its alliance with foreign nations. It cannot lose anything, because it has nothing to lose. The country has no nationality. Tegner discovered that in 1811, and short-sightedly bemoaned the fact. But his discovery came too late, for the race had already been ruined by the constant recruiting for the foolish wars of conquest. Of the 1,000,000 men which inhabited the country in the days of Gustavus Adolphus, 70,000 enlisted and were killed in the wars. I do not know for how many Charles X, Charles XI, and Charles XII were responsible, but it is easy to picture the offspring of those who remained behind, the men whom the crown had rejected as unfit for service. I repeat my statement that Sweden has no nationality. Can anybody tell me of anything Swedish in Sweden, except her firs, pine trees, and iron mines? And the latter will soon disappear from the market. What is our folklore but bad translations of French, English, and German ballads? What are the national costumes, the disappearance of which we so keenly regret, other than fragments and tatters of the aristocratic medieval costumes? In the days of Gustavus I, the dalesmen demanded that all those who wore low-cut or many-colored dresses should be punished. Probably the gay court dress from Burgundy had not yet filtered down to the daleswomen, but since then the fashion has changed many times. Tell me of a Swedish poem, a work of art, a piece of music, so specifically Swedish that it differs from all other not Swedish ones? Show me a Swedish building. There isn't one, and if there were, it would be either bad architecture or built in a foreign style. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I maintain that the Swedish nation is a stupid, conceited, slavish, envious, and uncouth nation, and for this reason it is approaching its end, and approaching it with great strides."
A tumult arose in the hall, but shouts of Charles XII could be heard above the turmoil.
"Gentlemen, Charles XII is dead. Let him sleep until his next jubilee. To no one are we more indebted for our denationalization than to him, and therefore, gentlemen, I call for 3 cheers for Charles XII. Gentlemen, long live Charles XII!"
"I call the meeting to order!" shouted the chairman.
Is it possible to imagine that a nation can be guilty of a greater piece of folly than to go to foreign nations in order to learn to write poetry? What unsurpassable oxen they must have been to walk for 1,600 years behind the plough and never conceive the idea of inventing a song. Then a jolly fellow of the court of Charles XII came along, destroyed the work of denationalization. The literary language, which up to now had been German, was henceforth to be Swedish. Down with the dog Sternhelm! What was his name? Edward Sternstrom.
The chairman's hammer came down on the table with a bang. The disturbance grew.
"Stop him! Down with the traitor! He's laughing at us!"
The Swedish nation can scream and brawl. I'm aware of that. They can do nothing else. And as you will not allow me to continue my lecture and discuss the government and the royal copyholds, I will conclude by saying that the servile louts whom I've heard tonight are ripe for the autocracy which they are sure to get. Believe my words, you will have an absolute monarchy before very long.
A push from the back jerked the words of the speaker out of his throat. He clung to the table.
"An ungrateful race who will not listen to the truth. Kick him out! Tear him to pieces!"
Ollie was dragged from the platform, but to the last moment, while knocks and blows rained down on him, he yelled like a madman.
"Long live Charles XII! Down with George Sternhelm!"
At last Ollie and Arvid were standing in the street.
"Whatever were you thinking of?"
asked Falk.
"You must have taken leave of your senses."
I believe I had. I had learned my speech by heart for the last 6 weeks. I knew to a word what I was going to say, but when I stood on the platform and saw all those eyes gazing at me, it all went to pieces. My artificial arguments broke down like a scaffolding. The floor underneath my feet gave away, and my thoughts became confusion. Was it very crazy?
"Yes, it was bad, and the papers will pull you to pieces."
"That's a pity. I admit it. I thought I was making it all so clear, but it was fun to give it to them for once."
"You only injured your cause. They'll never let you speak again."
Ollie sighed.
"Why in the name of fortune couldn't you leave Charles XII alone? That was your worst mistake."
"Don't ask me, I don't know."
"Do you still love the working man?" asked Falk.
"I pity him for allowing himself to be humbugged by adventurers, and I shall never abandon his cause, for his cause is the burning question of the near future, and all your politics aren't worth a penny in comparison."
The two friends were making their way back to Old Stockholm, and finally entered a café. It was between 9 and 10, and the room was almost empty. A single customer was sitting near the counter. He was reading from a book to a girl who sat beside him doing needlework. It was a pretty, domestic scene, but it seemed to make a strong impression on Falk, who started violently and changed colour.
"Sellén, you are here. Good evening, Beda,"
he said, with artificial cordiality, which sat strangely on him, shaking hands with the girl.
"Hullo, Falk, old chap," said Sellén. "So you are in the habit of coming here too. I might have guessed it. You are hardly ever at the Red Room now."
Arvid and Beda exchanged glances. The young girl looked too distinguished for her position. She had a delicate, intelligent face, which betrayed a secret sorrow, and a slender figure. Her movements were full of self-confidence and modesty. Her eyes were set in her face at a slightly upward angle. They seemed to be peering skyward, as if they were anticipating evil to drop down from the clouds. With this exception, they looked as if they were ready to play all the games which the whim of the moment might dictate.
"How grave you are,"
she said to Arvid, and her gaze dropped to her sewing.
"I've been to a grave meeting,"
said Arvid, blushing like a girl.
"What were you reading?" "I was reading the dedication from Faust," said Sellén, stretching out his hand and playing with Beta's needlework. A cloud darkened Arvid's face. The conversation became forced and restrained. Olle sat plunged in meditations, the subject of which must have been suicide. Arvid asked for a paper and was given The Incorruptible. He remembered that he had forgotten to look for the review of his poems. He hastily opened the paper, and on page 3 he found what he sought. His eyes met neither compliments nor abuse. The article was dictated by genuine and deep interest. The reviewer found Arvid's poetry neither better nor worse than the average, but just as selfish and meaningless. He said that it treated only of the poet's private affairs, of illicit relations, real or fictitious; that it coquetted with little sins, but did not mourn over great ones; that it was no better than the English fashion paper poetry, and he suggested that the author's portrait should have preceded the title page. Then the poems would have been illustrated. These simple truths made a great impression on Arvid. He had only read the advertisement in the Grey Bonnet, written by Struve, and the review in the Red Cap, coloured by personal friendship. He rose with a brief good night. "Are you going already?" asked Beta. "Yes. Are we going to meet tomorrow?" "Yes, as usual. Good night." Sellén and Olle followed him. "She's a rare child," said Sellén, after they proceeded a little way in silence. "I should thank you to be a little more restrained in your criticism." "I see. You're in love with her?" "Yes. I hope you don't mind." "Not in the least. I shan't get in your way." "And I beg you not to believe any evil of her." "Of course I won't. She's been on the stage." "How do you know? She never told me that." "No, but she told me. One can never trust these little devils too far." "Oh, well, there's no harm in that. I shall take her away from her surroundings as soon as I possibly can. Our relations are limited to meeting in the Haga Park at 8 in the morning and drinking the water from the well." "How sweet and simple! Do you never take her out to supper?" "I never thought of making such an improper suggestion. She would refute it with scorn. You are laughing. Laugh if you like. I still have faith in a woman who loves whatever class she may belong to, and whatever her past may have been. She told me that her life had not been above reproach, but I have promised never to ask her about her past." "Is it serious then?" "Yes, it's serious." "That's another thing. Good night, Falk. Are you coming with me, Olle?"
Good night."
"Poor Falk," said Sellén to Olle. "Now it's his turn to go through the mill, but there's no help for it. It's like changing one's teeth. A man is not grown up until he's had his experience."
"What about the girl?"
asked Olle, merely in order to show a polite interest, for his thoughts were elsewhere. "She's all right in her way, but Falk takes the matter seriously. She does too, apparently, as long as she sees any prospect of winning him. But unless Falk's quick about it, she will grow tired of waiting, and who knows whether she won't amuse herself meanwhile with somebody else. No, you don't understand these things. A man shouldn't hesitate in a love affair, but grab with both hands, otherwise somebody else will step in and spoil the game. Have you ever been in love, Olle?"
"I had an affair with one of the servants at home. There were consequences, and my father turned me out of the house. Since then I haven't looked at a woman."
"That was nothing very complicated, but to be betrayed, as it's called, that's what hurts. I can tell you, one must have nerves like the strings of a violin to play that game. We shall see what sort of fight Falk will make. With some men it goes very deep, and that's a pity. The door is open. Come in, Olle. I hope the beds are properly made, so that you will lie softly. But you must excuse my old bedmaker. She cannot shake up the feather beds. Her fingers are weak, don't you see? And the pillow, I'm afraid, may be hard and lumpy."
They had climbed the stairs and were entering the studio.
"It smells damp, as if the servant had aired the room or scrubbed it."
"You are laughing at yourself. There can be no more scrubbing. You have no longer a floor."
"Haven't I? Ah, that makes a difference. But what has become of it? Has it been used for fuel? There's nothing for it then, but to lie down on our mother earth, or rubbish, or whatever it may be."
They lay down in their clothes on the floor packing, having made a kind of bed for themselves of pieces of canvas and old newspapers, and push cases filled with sketches underneath their heads. Olle struck a match, produced a tallow candle from his trousers pocket, and put it on the floor beside him. A faint gleam flickered through the huge, bare studio, passionately resisting the volumes of darkness which tried to pour in through the colossal windows.
"It's cold tonight,"
said Olle, opening a greasy book.
"Cold? Oh, no! There are only 20 degrees of frost outside, and 30 in here.
because we are so high up. What's the time, I wonder?
I believe St. John's just struck 1.
St. John's? They have no clock. They are so poor that they had to pawn it.
There was a long pause, which was finally broken by Sellén.
What are you reading, Olle?
Never mind.
Never mind? Haven't you better be more civil, seeing that you are my guest?
An old cookery book, which I borrowed from Jägberg.
The deuce you did! Do let's read it. I've only had a cup of coffee and 3 glasses of water today.
What would you like?
Asked Olle, turning over the leaves.
Would you like some fish? Do you know what a mayonnaise is?
Mayonnaise? No, read it. It sounds good.
Well, listen. Number 139, mayonnaise. Take some butter, flour, and a pinch of English mustard and make it into a smooth paste. Beat it up with a good stock, and when boiling, add the yolks of a few eggs. Beat well and let it stand to cool.
No, thank you. That's not filling enough.
Oh, but that's not all. Then take a few spoonfuls of fine salad oil, vinegar, a spoonful of cream, some white pepper. Oh, yes, I see now. It's no good. Do you want something more substantial?
Try and find toad in the hole. It's my favorite dish.
I can't go on reading.
Do.
No, leave me alone.
They were silent. The candle went out, and it was quite dark.
Good night, Olle. Wrap yourself well up, or you'll be cold.
With what?
I don't know. Aren't we having a jolly time?
I wonder why one doesn't kill oneself when one is so cold.
Because it would be wrong. I find it quite interesting to live, if only to see what will come of it all in the end.
Are your parents alive, Sellén?
No, I'm illegitimate. Yours?
Yes, but it comes to the same thing.
You should be more grateful to Providence, Olle. One should always be grateful to Providence. I don't quite know why, but I suppose one should.
Again there was silence. The next time it was Olle who broke it.
Are you asleep?
No, I'm thinking of the statue of Gustavus Adolphus. Would you believe me when I...
Aren't you cold?
Cold? It's quite warm here.
My right foot is frozen.
Pull the paint box over you and tuck the brushes round your sides. Then you'll be warmer.
Do you really think anybody in the world is as badly off as we are?
Badly off? Do you call us badly off when we have a roof over our heads? Some of the professors at the academy, men who wear 3-cornered hats and swords now, were much worse off than we are. Professor Lundström slept during nearly the whole of April in the theatre, in the hop garden. There was style in that. He had the whole of the left stage box, and he maintains that after 1 o'clock there wasn't a single stall vacant. There was always a good house in the winter and a bad one in the summer. Good night. I'm going to sleep now.
Sellén snored, but Olle rose and paced the room up and down until the dawn broke in the east, and then day took pity on him and gave him the peace which night had denied him. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Red Room by August Strindberg. Translated by Ellie Schlesinger. Recording by William Peck. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. Checkmate. The winter passed. Slowly for the sufferers, more quickly for those who were less unhappy. Spring came with its disappointed hopes of sun and verdure, and in its turn made room for the summer, which was but a short introduction to the autumn. On a May morning, Arvid Falk, now a member of the permanent staff of the Workman's Flag, was strolling along the quay, watching the vessels loading and discharging their cargoes. He looked less well-groomed than in the days gone by. His black hair was longer than fashion decreed, and he wore a beard à la Henry IV, which gave his thin face an almost savage expression. An ominous fire burned in his eyes, a fire denoting the fanatic or the drunkard. He seemed to be endeavouring to make a choice among the vessels, but was unable to come to a decision. After hesitating for a considerable time, he accosted one of the sailors, who was wheeling a barrelful of goods onto the brig. He courteously raised his hat. "Can you tell me the destination of this ship?" he asked timidly, imagining that he was speaking in a bold voice.
"Ship? I see no ship."
The bystanders laughed.
"But if you want to know where the brig's bound for, go and read the bill over there."
Falk was disconcerted, but he forced himself to say angrily,
"Can't you give a civil reply to a civil question?"
"Go to hell, and don't stand there swearing at a fellow. 'Tention!"
The conversation broke off, and Falk made up his mind.
He retraced his footsteps, passed through a narrow street, crossed the market-place, and turned the first corner. Before the door of a dirty-looking house he stopped. Again he hesitated. He could never overcome his besetting sin of indecision. A small, ragged boy with a squint came running along, his hands full of proofs in long strips. As he was going to pass Falk, the latter stopped him. "Is the editor upstairs?" he asked. "Yes, he's been there since 7, replied the boy breathlessly. "Has he asked for me?" "Yes, more than once." "Is he in a bad temper?" "He always is." The boy shot upstairs like an arrow. Falk, following on his heels, entered the editorial office. It was a hole with 2 windows looking on a dark street. Before each of the windows stood a plain deal table, covered with paper, pens, newspapers, scissors, and a gum bottle. One of the tables was occupied by his old friend, Ygberg, dressed in a ragged black coat, engaged in reading proofs. At the other table, which was Falk's, sat a man in shirt-sleeves, his head covered by a black silk cap of the kind affected by the communards. His face was covered by a red beard, and his thick-set figure with its clumsy outlines betrayed the man of the people. As Falk entered, the communard's legs kicked the table violently. He turned up his shirt-sleeves, displaying blue tattoo marks representing an anchor and an Anglo-Saxon R, seized a pair of scissors, savagely stabbed the front page of a morning paper, cut out a paragraph, and said rudely, with his back to Falk, "Where you been?" "I been ill," replied Falk defiantly, as he thought, but humbly, as Ygberg told him afterwards. "It's a lie! You've been drinking. I saw you at the café last night." "Surely I can go where I please." "You can do what you like, but you've got to be here at the stroke of the clock, according to our agreement. It's 8:15. I am well aware that gentlemen who have been to college, where they imagine they learn a lot, have no idea of method and manners. Don't you call it ill-bred to be late at your work? Aren't you behaving like a boor when you compel your employer to do your work? What? It's the world turned upside down. The employee treats the master, the employer, if you like, as if he were a dog, and capital is oppressed." "When did you come to these conclusions?"
"When? Just now, sir, just now. And I trust these conclusions are worth considering in spite of that. But I discovered something else. You are an ignoramus. You can't spell. Look at this. What's written here? Read it. 'We hope that all those who will have to go through their drill next year.' Is it possible? Who? Next year?"
"Well, that's quite right," said Falk.
"Right? How dare you say it's right? It's customary to say 'who' in the next year, and consequently it should also be written in this form."
"That's right, too. Definitions of time govern either the accusative or..."
"None of your learned palaver. Don't talk nonsense to me. Besides, this you spell Exercise with an X only, although it should be spelt Exercise. Don't make excuses. Is it Exercise or Exsercice?
"Of course, people say..."
"People say, therefore Exsercice is right. The customary pronunciation must be correct. Perhaps, all things considered, I'm a fool. Perhaps I can't spell correctly. But enough now. Get to work and another time pay a little more attention to the clock." He jumped up from his chair with a yell and boxed the ears of the printer's boy. "Are you sleeping in a bright daylight, you young scamp? I'll teach you to keep awake. You are not yet too old for a thrashing." He seized the victim by the braces, threw him on a pile of unsold papers, and beat him with his belt.
"I wasn't asleep. I was only closing my eyes a little," howled the boy.
"What? You dare to deny it? You've learned to lie, but I will teach you to speak the truth. Were you asleep or were you not asleep? Tell the truth or you'll be sorry for it."
"I wasn't asleep," whimpered the boy, too young and inexperienced to get over his difficulty by telling a lie.
"I see. You mean to stand by your lie, you hardened little devil, you insolent liar."
He was going to continue the thrashing when Falk rose, approached the editor and said firmly, "Don't touch him. I saw he was not asleep."
"By Jove, listen to him! Who the dickens are you? Don't touch him? Who said those words? I must have heard a gnat buzzing, or perhaps my ears deceive me. I hope so, I do hope so. Mr. Ygberg, you're a decent fellow, you haven't been to college. Did you happen to see whether this boy, whom I'm holding by the braces like a fish, was asleep or not?"
"If he wasn't asleep," replied Ygberg, phlegmatically and obligingly. He was just on the point of dropping off.
Well answered! Would you mind holding him, Mr. Ygberg, while I give him a lesson with my cane in telling the truth?
You no right to beat him, said Falk. If you dare to touch him, I shall open the window and call for the police.
I am master in my own house, and I always thrash my apprentices. He is an apprentice and will be employed in the editorial office later on. That's what's going to be done, although there are people who imagine that a paper can only be properly edited by a man who has been to college. Speak up, Gustav, are you learning newspaper work? Answer, but tell the truth, or... Before the boy had time to reply, the door was open, and a head looked in, a very striking head, and certainly not one that might have been expected in such a place. But it was a well-known head. It had been painted 5 times. At the sight of it, the editor strapped his belt round him, hastily put on his coat, bowed, and smiled. The visitor asked whether the editor was disengaged. He received a satisfactory reply, and the last remnant of the working man disappeared, when a quick movement swept the communard's cap off the editor's head. Both men went into the inner office, and the door closed behind them.
I wonder what the Count's after,
said Ygberg, with the air of a schoolboy, when the master had left the classroom. I don't wonder in the least, said Falk. I think I know the kind of rascal he is, and the kind of rascal the editor is, but I am surprised to find that you have changed from a mere blockhead into an infamous wretch, and that you lend yourself to these disgraceful acts. Don't lose your temper, my dear fellow. You were not at the House last night. No? In my opinion, Parliament is a farce, except in so far as the private interests are concerned. What about the Triton? The question was put to the vote, and it was resolved that the government, in view of the greatness, the patriotism, which characterized the enterprise, should take over the debentures while the society went into liquidation, that is to say, settle the current affairs. Which means that the government will prop up the house while the foundation crumbles away, so as to give the directors time to get out of harm's way. You would rather that all those small... I know what you're going to say. All those small capitalists. Yes, I would rather see them working with their small capital than idling away their time and lending it out at interest. But above all things, I should like to see those sharpers in prison. It would help to put a stop to these swindles. But they call it political economy. It's vile. There's something else I want to say. You covet my post. You shall have it. I hate the idea of your sitting in your corner with a heart filled with bitterness, because you have to sweep up after me in reading proofs. There are already too many of my unprinted articles lying on the desk of this contemptible apostle of liberty to tempt me to go on telling cock and bull stories. The Red Cap was too conservative to please me, but the People's Flag is too dirty. Yes, I am glad to see you relinquishing your chimeras and listening to common sense. Go to the Grey Bonnet. You'll have a chance there. I have lost the illusion that the cause of the oppressed lies in good hands, and I think it would be a splendid mission to enlighten the people on the value of public opinion, especially printed public opinion, and its origin. But I shall never abandon the cause. The door to the inner room opened again, and the editor came out. He stood still in the middle of the office and said, in an unnaturally conciliatory voice, almost politely, I want you to look after the office for a day, Mr. Falk. I have to go away on important business. Mr. Ygberg will assist you so far as the daily business is concerned. His lordship will be using my room for a few minutes. I hope, gentlemen, you will see that he has everything he wants. Oh, please don't trouble, came the Count's voice from the inside room, where he was sitting bent over a manuscript. The editor went, and strange to say, 2 minutes later the Count went also. He had waited just long enough to avoid being seen in the company of the editor of the Workman's Flag. Are you sure he's gone? asked Ygberg. I hope so, said Falk. Then I'll go and have a look at the market. By and by, have you seen Beda since? Since when? Since she left the café and went to live in the room by herself. How did you know she did? Do control your temper, Falk. You'll never get on in the world unless you do. Yes, you're right. I must take matters more calmly, or else I'll go out of my mind. But that girl, whom I love so dearly, how shamefully she treated me, to give to that clumsy boor all she denied to me, and then to have the face to tell me that it proved the purity of her love for me. Most excellent dialectics, and she is quite right too, for her proposition is correct. She does love you, doesn't she? She's running after me, anyhow. And you? I hate her with all my soul, but I am afraid to meet her. which proves that you are still in love with her. Let's change the subject. You really must control yourself, Falk. Take an example from me. But now I'll go and sun myself. One should enjoy life as much as possible in this dreary world. Gustav, you can go and play buttons for an hour, if you like."
Falk was left alone. The sun threw his rays over the steep roof opposite and warmed the room. He opened the window and put out his head for a breath of fresh air, but he only breathed the pungent odours of the gutter. His glance swept the street on the right, and far away in the distance he saw a part of a steamer, a few waves of the lake of Mälar glittering in the sunlight, and a hollow in the rocks on the other side, which were just beginning to show a little green here and there. He thought of the people whom the steamer would take into the country, who would bathe in those waves and feast their eyes on the young green. But at this moment the whitesmith below him began to hammer a sheet of iron, so that the house and window panes trembled. 2 or 3 labourers went by with a rattling, evil-smelling cart, and an odour of brandy, beer, sawdust, and pine branches poured out of the inn opposite. He shut the window and sat down at his table. Before him lay a heap of about 100 provincial papers, from which it was his task to make cuttings. He took off his cuffs and began to look through them. They smelt of oil and soot, and blackened his hands. That was their principal feature. Nothing he considered worthy of reprinting was of any use, for he had to consider the programme of his paper. A report to the effect that the workmen of a certain factory had given the foreman a silver snuff-box had to be cut out, but the notice of a manufacturer having given 500 crowns to his working-men's funds had to be ignored. A paragraph reporting that the Duke of Holland had hand-selled a pile-driver, and Director Halsheim celebrated the event in verses, had to be cut out and reproduced in full, because the people like to read this kind of thing. If he could add a little biting sarcasm, all the better, for then they were sure to hear about it. Roughly speaking, the rule was to cut out everything said in favour of journalists and working men, and everything deprecating clergymen, officers, wholesale merchants, not retail, the professions, and famous writers. Moreover, at least once a week, it was his business to attack the management of the Royal Theatre, and severely criticize the frivolous musical comedies produced in the Little Theatre. In the name of morality and public decency, he had noticed that the working men did not patronize these theatres. Once a month the town councillors had to be accused of extravagance. As often as opportunity arose, the form of government, not government itself, had to be assailed. The editor severely censored all attacks on certain members of Parliament and ministers. Which? That was a mystery, unknown to even the editor. It depended on a combination of circumstances which only the secret proprietor of the paper could deal with. Falk worked with his scissors until one of his hands was black. He had frequent recourse to the gum bottle, but the gum smelt sour, and the heat in the room was stifling. The poor aloe, capable of enduring thirst like a camel, and patiently receiving countless stabs from an irritated steel nib, increased the terrible resemblance to a desert. It had been stabbed until it was covered with black wounds. Its leaves shot, like a bundle of donkey's ears, out of the parched mould. Falk probably had a vague consciousness of something of this sort as he sat plunged in thought, for before he could realize what he was doing, he had docked off all the earlobes. When he perceived what he had done, he painted the wounds with gum and watched it drying in the sun. He vaguely wondered for a few moments how he was going to get dinner, for he had strayed onto their path which leads to destruction, so-called poor circumstances. Finally he lit a pipe, and watched the soothing smoke rising and bathing for a few seconds in the sunshine. It made him feel more tolerant of poor Sweden, as she expressed herself in these daily, weekly, and monthly reports called the press. He put the scissors aside and threw the papers into a corner. He shared the contents of the earthen water bottle with the aloe. The miserable object looked like a creature whose wings had been clipped, a spirit standing in a bog on its head, digging for something, for pearls, for instance, or at any rate for empty shells. Then despair, like a tanner, seized him again with a long hook and pushed him down into the vat, where he was to be prepared for the knife, which should scrape his skin off and make him like everybody else. And he felt no remorse, no regret at a wasted life, but only despair at having to die in his youth, died a spiritual death, before he had an opportunity of being of use in the world, despair that he was being cast into the fire as a useless reed.
The clock in the German church struck 11, and the chimes began to play O Blessed Land and My Life a Wave. As if seized by the same idea, an Italian barrel organ with a flute accompaniment began to play the Blue Danube. So much music put new life into the tinsmith below, who began hammering his iron sheet with redoubled energy. The din and uproar prevented Falk from becoming aware of the opening of the door and the entrance of two men. One of them had a tall, lean figure, an aquiline nose and long hair. The other one was short, blond and thick-set. His perspiring face much resembled the quadruped, which the Hebrews considered more unclean than any other. Their outward appearance betrayed an occupation requiring neither much mental nor physical strength. It had a quality of vagueness, pointing to irregularity of work and habits.
"Hush!" whispered the tall man. "Are you alone?"
Falk was partly pleased, partly annoyed at the sight of his visitors.
"Quite alone. The Red One's left town."
"Has he?
Come along then and have some dinner."
Falk had no objection. He locked the office and went with his visitors to the nearest public house, where the three of them sat down in the darkest corner.
"Here, have some brandy,"
said the thick-set man, whose glazed eyes sparkled at the sight of the brandy bottle. But Falk, who had only joined his friends because he was yearning for sympathy and comfort, paid no attention to the proffered delights.
"I haven't been as miserable as this for a long time,"
he said.
"Have some bread and butter and herring," said the tall man. "We'll have some caraway cheese. Here, waiter." "Can't you advise me?" Falk began again. "I can't stand the Red One any longer, and I must—" "Here, waiter, bring some black bread. Drink, Falk, and don't talk nonsense."
Falk was thrown out of the saddle. He made no second attempt to find sympathy with his mental difficulties, but tried another, not unusual way.
"Your advice is the brandy bottle?"
he said.
"Very well, with all my soul then."
The alcohol flowed through his veins like poison, for he was not accustomed to taking strong drink in the morning. The smell of cooking, the buzzing of the flies, the odour of the faded flowers, which stood by the side of the dirty table-centre, induced in him a strange feeling of well-being. And his low companions, with their neglected linen, their greasy coats, and their unwashed gale-bird faces, harmonized so well with his own degraded position that he felt a wild joy surging in his heart.
"We were in the deer park last night, and by Jove, we did drink,"
said the stout man, once more enjoying the past delights of memory. Falk had no answer to this, and moreover, his thoughts were running in a different groove.
"Isn't it jolly to have a morning off?"
said the tall man, who seemed to be playing the part of tempter.
"It is indeed,"
replied Falk, trying to measure his freedom, as it were, with a glance through the window. But all he saw was a fire escape and a dustbin in a yard which never received more than a faint reflection of the summer sky.
"Half a pint? That's it. Ah, well, what do you say to the Triton? Ha, ha, ha!" "Don't laugh," said Falk. "Many a poor devil will suffer through it." "Who are the poor devils? Poor capitalists? Are you sorry for those who don't work, but live on the proceeds of their money? No, my boy, you are still full of prejudice. There was a funny tale in the Hornet about a wholesale merchant who bequeathed to the crèche Bethlehem 20,000 crowns, and was given the order Vasa for his munificence. Now it has transpired that the bequest was in Triton shares, with joint liability, and so the crèche is of course bankrupt. Isn't that lovely? The assets went 25 cradles and an oil painting by an unknown master. It's too funny. The portrait was valued at 5 crowns. Ha, ha!"
The subject of the conversation irritated Falk, for he knew more of the matter than the two others.
"Did you see the Red Cap unmask that humbug Schönström, who published that volume of miserable verses at Christmas?"
said the stout man.
"It really was a rare pleasure to learn the truth about the rascal. I have more than once given him a sound slating in the Copper Snake."
"But you were rather unjust. His verses were not as bad as you said," remarked the tall man.
"Not as bad. They were worse than mine, which the Grey Bonnet tore to shreds. Don't you remember?"
"By the by, Falk, have you been to the theatre in Deer Park?"
asked the tall man.
"No."
"What a pity!
The Lundholm gang of thieves is playing there. Impudent fellow, the director. He sent no seats to the Copper Snake, and when we arrived at the theatre last night, he turns us out. But he'll pay for it. You give it to the dog. Here's paper and pencil. Heading: Theatre and Music, Deer Park Theatre. Now you go on." "But I haven't seen the company." "What does that matter? Have you ever written about anything you hadn't seen?"
No, I've unmasked humbugs, but I have never attacked unoffending people.
and I know nothing about this company."
"They are a miserable lot, just scum,"
affirmed the stout man.
"Sharpen your pen and bruise his heel. You are splendid at it."
"Why don't you bruise him yourselves?"
"Because the printers know our handwriting and some of them walk on in the crowds. Moreover, Lundholm is a violent fellow. He will be sure to invade the editorial office. Then it will be a good thing to be able to tell him that the criticism is a communication from the public. And while you write up the stage, I will do the concerts. There was a sacred concert last week. Wasn't the man's name Dowbry with a Y?"
"No, with an I,"
corrected the fat man.
"Don't forget he's a tenor and sang Stabat Mater."
"How do you spell it?"
"I'll tell you in a minute."
The stout editor of the Copper Snake took a packet of greasy newspapers from the gas meter.
"Here's the whole program and I believe a criticism as well."
Falk could not help laughing.
"How could a criticism appear simultaneously with the advertisement?"
"Why shouldn't it? But we shan't want it. I will criticize that French mob myself. You better do the literature, fatty."
"Do the publishers send books to the Copper Snake?"
asked Falk.
"Are you mad?"
"Do you buy them yourselves for the sake of reviewing them?"
"Buy them? Greenhorn? Have another glass and cheer up, and I'll treat you to a chop."
"Do you read the books which you review?"
"Who do you think has time for reading books? Isn't it enough to write about them? It's quite sufficient to read the papers. Moreover, it's our principle to slate everything."
"An absurd principle."
"Not at all. It brings all the author's enemies and enviers on one side, and so one's in the majority. Those who are neutral would rather see an author slated than praised. To the nobody there is something edifying and comforting in the knowledge that the road to fame is beset with thorns. Don't you think so?"
"You might be right, but the idea of playing with human destinies in this way is terrible."
"Oh, it's good for the young and old. I know that, for I was persistently slated in my young days."
"But you mislead public opinion."
"The public does not want to have an opinion. It wants to satisfy its passions. If I praise your enemy, you writhe like a worm, and tell me that I have no judgment. If I praise your friend, you tell me that I have. Take that last piece of the dramatic theatre, Fatty, which has just been published in book form."
"Are you sure that it's been published?"
"I'm certain of it. It's quite safe to say that there isn't enough action in it. That's a phrase the public knows well. Laugh a little at the beautiful language. That's good old disparaging praise. Then attack the management for having accepted such a play, and point out that the moral teaching is doubtful. A very safe thing to say about most things. But as you haven't seen the performance, say what you want of room compels us to postpone our criticism of the acting. Do that, and you can't make a mistake."
"Who is the unfortunate author?"
asked Falk. "Nobody knows."
"Think of his parents, his friends, who will read your possibly quite unjust remarks."
"What's that got to do with the Copper Snake? They were hoping to see a friend slated. They know what to expect from the Copper Snake."
"Have you no conscience?"
"Has the public which supports us a conscience? Do you think we could survive if it did not support us? Would you like to hear a paragraph which I wrote on the present slate of literature? I can assure you it will give you plenty to think about. I have a copy with me, but let us have some stout first. Waiter, here! Now I'm going to give you a treat. You can profit by it if you like."
We have not heard so much whining in the Swedish verse factory for many years. This constant pulling is enough to drive a man into a lunatic asylum. Robust rascals counterwall like cats in March. They imagine that anemia and adenoids will arouse public interest now that consumption is played out. And withal they have backs broad as brewers' horses and faces red as tapsters. This one whimpers about the infidelity of women, although all he has to go on is the bought loyalty of a wanton. That one tells us that he has no gold, but that his harp is all he possesses in the world. The liar! He has 5,000 crowns dividend per annum and the right to an endowed chair in the Swedish Academy. A third is faithless, cynical scoffer, who cannot open his lips without breathing forth his impure spirit and babbling blasphemies. Their verses are not a whit better than those which 30 years ago clergymen's daughters sang to the guitar. They should write for confectioners at a penny a line, and not waste the time of publishers, printers, and reviewers with their rhymes. What do they write about? About nothing at all, that is to say, about themselves. Is it bad form to talk about oneself? But it is quite the right thing to write about oneself. What are they bemoaning? Their incapacity to achieve a success? Success? That is the word. Have they produced one single thought, capable of benefiting their fellow creatures, the age in which they live? If they had but once championed the cause of the helpless, their sins might be forgiven them. But they have not. Therefore they are a sounding brass. Nay, they are a clanking piece of tin, and the cracked bell of a fool's cap. For they have no other love than the love of their next edition of their books, the love of the academy and the love of themselves.
That's sarcasm, isn't it? What?
It's unjust, said Falk.
I find it very impressive,
said the stout man.
You can't deny that it is well written, can you? He wields a pen which pierces shoe leather.
Now, lads, let's stop talking and write. Afterwards you shall have coffee and liqueurs.
And they wrote of human merit and human unworthiness and broke hearts as if they were breaking eggshells. Falk felt an indescribable longing for fresh air. He opened the window which looked on the yard. It was dark and narrow like a tomb. All he could see was a small square of the sky, if he bent his head far back. He fancied that he was sitting in his grave, breathing brandy fumes and kitchen smells, eating the funeral repast at the burial of his youth, his principles and his honour. He smelt the elder blossoms which stood on the table, but they reeked of decay. Once more he looked out of the window, eager to find an object which would not inspire him with loathing. But there was nothing but a newly tarred dustbin, standing like a coffin, with its contents of cast-off finery and broken litter. His thoughts climbed up the fire-escape which seemed to lead from dirt, stench and shame right up into the blue sky. But no angels were ascending and descending, and no love was watching from above. There was nothing but empty blue void. Falk took his pen and began to shade the letters of the headline, Theatre, when a strong hand clutched his arm and a firm voice said,
Come along, I want to speak to you.
He looked up, taken back and ashamed. Borg stood beside him, apparently determined not to let him go.
May I introduce?
began Falk.
No, you may not,
interrupted Borg.
I don't want to know any drunken scribblers. Come along.
He drew Falk to the door.
Where's your hat? Oh, here it is. Come along.
They were in the street. Borg took his arm, led him to the nearest square, marched him into a shop, and bought him a pair of canvas shoes. This done, he drew him across the loch to the harbour. A cutter lay there, fast to her moorings, but ready to go to sea. In the cutter sat young Levi reading a Latin grammar and munching a piece of bread and butter.
This,
said Borg,
is the cutter Uriah. It's an ugly name, but she is a good boat, and she is insured in the Triton. There sits her owner, the Hebrew lad Isaac, reading a Latin grammar. The idiot wants to go to college, and from this moment you are engaged as his tutor for the summer. And now we'll be off for our summer residence at Namdo. All hands on board. No demur. Ready? Put off.
End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The Red Room by August Strindberg. Translated by Ellie Schlesinger. Recording by William Peck. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. Correspondence.
Candidate Borg to journalist Struve. Namdo, June 18th. Old scandalmonger, as I am convinced that neither you nor Levin have paid off your installments of the loan made by the Shoemakers' Bank, I am sending you herewith a promissory note so that you may raise a new loan from the Architects' Bank. If there is anything over after the installments have been paid up, we will divide it equally amongst us. Please send me my share by steamer to Dalaro, where I will call for it. I have now had Falk under treatment for a month, and I believe he is on the road to recovery. You will remember that after Ollie's famous lecture, he left us abruptly, and instead of making use of his brother and his brother's connections, went on the staff of the Workman's Flag, where he was ill-treated for 50 crowns a month. But the wind of freedom which blew there must have had a demoralizing effect on him, for he became morose and neglected his appearance. With the help of the girl Beda, I kept my eye on him, and when I considered him ripe for a rupture with the communards, I went and fetched him away. I found him in a low public house called the Star, in the company of 2 scandal writers with whom he was drinking brandy. I believe they were writing at the same time. He was in a melancholy condition, as you would say. As you know, I regard mankind with calm indifference. Men are to me geological preparations, minerals. Some crystallize under one condition, others under another. It all depends on certain laws or circumstances which should leave us completely unmoved. I don't weep over the lime spar because it is not as hard as a rock crystal. Therefore, I cannot regard Falk's condition as melancholy. It was the outcome of his temperament, heart, you would say, plus the circumstances which his temperament had created. But he was certainly down when I found him. I took him on board our cutter and he remained passive. But just as we had pushed off, he turned round and saw Beda standing on the shore, beckoning to him. I can't think how she got there. On seeing her, our man went clear out of his mind. Put me ashore, he screamed, threatening to jump overboard. I seized him by the arms, pushed him into the cabin and locked the door. As we passed Vaxholm, I posted 2 letters, one to the editor of the Workman's Flag, begging him to excuse Falk's absence, and the other to his landlady, asking her to send him his clothes. In the meantime, he had calmed down, and when he beheld the sea and the skerries, he became sentimental, and talked a great deal of nonsense. He had lost all hope of ever seeing God's green earth again, he said, and so on. But presently he began to suffer from something like qualms of conscience. He maintained that he had no right to be happy and take a holiday when there were so many unhappy people in the world. He imagined that he was neglecting his duty towards the scoundrel who edits the Workman's Flag, and begged us to row him back. When I talked to him of the terrible time he had just gone through, he replied that it was the duty of all men to work and suffer for one another. This view had almost become a religion with him, but I have cured him of it with soda water and salt baths. He was completely broken, and I had great difficulty in patching him up, for it was hard to say where the physical trouble ended and the psychical began. I must say that in a certain respect he excites my astonishment. I won't say admiration, for I never admire anybody. He seems to suffer from an extraordinary mania which makes him act in direct contradiction to his own interest. He might have been in a splendid position if he had not thrown up his career in the civil service, particularly as his brother would, in that case, have helped him with a sum of money. Instead of that, he cast his reputation to the winds, and slaved for a brutal plebeian, and all for the sake of his ideals. It is most extraordinary. But he seems to be mending at last, more particularly after a lesson he had here. Can you believe it? He called the fishermen "sir," and took off his hat to them. In addition, he indulged in cordial chats with the natives, in order to find out how these people lived. The result was that the fishermen pricked up their ears, and one of them asked me one day whether this Falk paid for his own board, or whether the doctor, I, paid for him. I told Falk about it, and it depressed him. He is always despondent whenever he is robbed of a delusion. A few days later he talked to our landlord on the subject of universal suffrage. Later on our landlord asked me whether Falk was in poor circumstances. During the first few days he ran up and down the shore like a madman. Often he swam far out into the fjord, as if he never meant to return again. As I always looked upon suicide as a sacred right of every individual, I did not interfere. Isaac told me that Falk had opened his heart to him on the subject of the girl Beda. She seems to have made an awful fool of him. Apropos of Isaac, he is one of the shrewdest fellows I ever met. He has, after 1 month's study, mastered the Latin grammar, and he reads his Caesar as we read the Grey Bonnet, and what's more, he knows all about it, which we never did. His brain is receptive, that is to say, capable of assimilating knowledge. In addition to this, it is practical. This combination has produced many a genius, in spite of gross stupidity in many other respects. Every now and then he indulges his business instincts. The other day he gave us a brilliant example of his talent in that direction. I know nothing about his financial position, for in that respect he is very reticent. But a little while ago he had to pay a few 100 crowns. He was very fidgety, and as he did not want to apply to his brother, of the Triton, with whom he is not on friendly terms, he asked me to lend him the sum. I was not in a position to do so. Thereupon he sat down, took a sheet of notepaper, wrote a letter, and sent it off by special messenger. For a few days nothing happened. In front of our cottage grew a pretty little oak wood, which shaded us from the sun and sheltered us from the strong sea breezes. I don't know much about trees and things pertaining to nature, but I love to sit in the shade when the days are hot. One morning, on pulling up my blind, I was dumbfounded. I was looking at the open fjord and a yacht riding at anchor about a cable length from the shore. Every tree had gone, and Isaac was sitting on a stump reading Euclid and counting the trunks as they were being carried on board the yacht. I wakened Falk. He was furious and had a quarrel with Isaac, who made 1,000 crowns on the deal. Our landlord received 200, all he had asked for. I could have killed Isaac, not because he had had the trees cut down, but because I had not thought of it first. Falk said it was unpatriotic, but Isaac swears that the removal of the rubbish has improved the view. He declares that he will take a boat next week and visit the neighboring islets with the same object. Our landlord's wife cried all day long, but her husband went to Dalarö to buy her a new dress. He remained away for 2 whole days, and when he returned at last, he was drunk. There was nothing in the boat, and when his wife asked for the new dress, the fisherman confessed that he had forgotten all about it. Enough for the present. Write soon and tell me a few new scandals, and be careful how you manipulate the loan. Your deadly enemy in security, H.B. P.S. I read in the papers that a civil service bank is about to be established. Who is going to put money into it? Keep an eye on it, so that we can place a bill there when the time comes. Please put the following paragraph into the Grey Bonnet. It will affect my medical degree. Scientific discovery, C.A.N.D. M.E.D. Henrik Borg. One of our younger, distinguished medical men has, while engaged in zootomic research on the skerries near Stockholm, discovered a new species of the family Clypeaster, to which he has given the very pertinent name of Maritimus. Its characteristics may be described as follows: cutaneous laminae in 5 porous ambulacral shields, and 5 interambulacral shields with warts instead of pricks. The animal has excited much interest in the scientific world. Arvid Falk to Beda Peterson, August 18th. As I walk along the seashore and see the roadweed growing in sand and pebbles, I think of you blossoming for a whole winter in an inn of old Stockholm. I know nothing more delightful than to lie full length on a cliff and feel the fragments of gneiss tickling my ribs while I gaze seaward. It makes me feel proud, and I imagine that I am Prometheus, while the vulture, that is you, has to lie in a feather bed in a Sandburg street and swallow mercury. Seaweed is of no use while it grows at the bottom of the sea, but when it decays on the shore, it smells of iodine, which is a cure for love, and bromide, which is a cure for insanity. There was no hell until paradise was quite complete, that is to say, until woman was created. Chestnut. Far away, by the open sea, there lives a pair of eider ducks, in an old quarter cask. If one considers that the stretched out wings of the eider measure 2 feet, it seems a miracle, and love is a miracle. The whole world is too small for me. Beda Peterson to Mr. Falk. Stockholm, August 18th. Dear friend, I have just received your letter, but I cannot say that I have understood it. I see you think that I am in Sandburg Street, but that is a great lie, and I can understand why that blackguard says I am. It is a great lie, and I swear that I love you as much as before. I often long to see you, but it cannot be yet. Your faithful Beda. P.S. Dear Arvid, if you could lend me 30 crowns till the 15th, I swear I will pay it back on the 15th, because I shall receive money then. I have been so ill, and I am often so sad, that I wish I was dead. The barmaid in the café was a horrid creature, who was jealous because of the stout Berglund, and that is why I left. All they say of me is lies. I hope you are well, and don't forget your... the same. You can send the money to Hulda in the café, then I shall get it. Candidate Borg to journalist Struve, Namdo, August 18th. Conservative blackguard, you must have embezzled the money, for instead of receiving cash, I received a request for payment from the shoemaker's bank. Do you imagine a man has a right to steal because he has a wife and children? Render an account at once, else I shall come up to town and make a row. I read the paragraph, which, of course, was not without errors. It said zoologic instead of zootomic, and Clypeaster instead of Clypeaster. Nevertheless, I hope it will serve its purpose. Falk went mad after receiving a letter in a feminine handwriting a day or 2 ago. 1 minute he was climbing trees, at the next he was diving to the bottom of the sea. I expect it was the crisis. I'll talk to him like a father a little later on. Isaac has sold his yacht without asking my permission, and for this reason we are, at the moment, enemies. He is at present reading the 2nd book of Livy and founding a fishing company. He has bought a strömming net, a seal gun, 25 stems, a salmon line, 2 bass nets, a shed for drag nets, and a church. The latter seems incredible, but it is quite true. I admit it was scorched a little by the Russians in 1719, but the walls are still standing. The parish possesses a new one, which serves the ordinary purpose. The old one was used as a parochial storeroom. Isaac is thinking of making the academy a present of it, in the hope of receiving the order of Vasak. The latter had been given for less. Isaac's uncle, who is an innkeeper, received it for treating the deaf and dumb to bread and butter and beer when they used the riding ground in the autumn. He did it for 6 years. Then he received his reward. Now he takes no more notice of the deaf and dumb, which proves how fatal the order of Vasa may be under certain circumstances. Unless I drown the rascal Isaac, he won't rest until he has bought all of Sweden. Pull yourself together and behave like an honorable man, or I shall bear down upon you like Jehu, and then you'll be lost. H.B. P.S. When you write the notice relating to the distinguished strangers at the Laurel, mention me and Falk, but ignore Isaac. His presence irritates me. He went and sold his yacht. Send me some blank bills, blue ones, solo bills, when you send the money. Candidate Borg to journalist Struve. Namdo, September 18th. Man of honor. Money arrived. Seems to have been exchanged. For the Architects' Bank always pays in Scandinavian bills of 50. However, never mind. Falk is well. He has passed the crisis like a man. He has regained his self-confidence, a most important quality as far as worldly success goes, but a quality which, according to statistics, is considerably weakened in children who lose their mothers at an early age. I gave him a prescription, which he promised to try all the more readily as the same idea had occurred to him. He will return to his former profession, but without accepting his brother's help, his last act of folly of which I do not approve. Re-enter society, register his name with the rest of the cattle, become respectable, make himself a social position, and hold his tongue until his word bears weight. The latter is absolutely necessary, if he is to remain alive. He has a tendency to insanity, and is bound to lose his reason unless he forgets all about these ideas which I really cannot understand, and I don't believe that he himself could define what it is he wants. He has begun to cure, and I am amazed at his progress. I'm sure he'll end as a member of the royal household. That is what I believed until a few days ago, when he read in a newspaper an account of the Commune at Paris. He at once had a relapse, and took to climbing trees again. He got over it, though, and now he does not dare to look at a paper, but he never says a word. Beware of the man when his apprenticeship is over. Isaac is now learning Greek. He considers the textbooks too stupid and too long. Therefore he takes them to pieces, cuts out the most important bits, and pastes them into an account book, which he has arranged like a summary for his forthcoming examinations. Unfortunately, his increasing knowledge of the classics makes him impudent and disagreeable. So, for instance, he dared to contradict the pastor the other day while playing a game of draughts with him, and maintain that the Jews had invented Christianity, and that all those baptized were really Jews. Latin and Greek have ruined him. I am afraid that I have nursed the dragon in my hairy bosom. If this is so, then the seed of the woman must bruise the serpent's head. H.B. P.S. Falk has shaved his American beard and no longer raises his hat to the fishermen. You'll not hear from me again from Namdo. We are returning to town on Monday. End of chapter 26.
Chapter 27 of The Red Room by August Strindberg. Translated by Ellie Schlesinger. Recording by William Peck. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. Recovery. It was autumn again. On a clear November morning, Arvid Falk was walking from his elegantly furnished rooms in Great Street to Man's boarding school near Charles XII Market, where he had an appointment as master of the Swedish language and history. During the autumn months he had made his way back into civilized society, a proceeding which had brought home to him the fact that he had become a perfect savage during his wanderings. He had discarded his disreputable hat and bought a high one, which he found difficult at first to keep on his head. He had bought gloves, but in his savagery he had replied 15 when the shop girl asked for his size, and blushed when his reply brought a smile to the face of every girl in the shop. The fashion had changed since he had last bought clothes. As he was walking through the streets, he looked upon himself as a dandy, and every now and then examined his reflection in the shop windows to see whether his garments set well. Now he was strolling up and down the pavement before the Dramatic Theatre and waiting for the clock on St. James' Church to strike 9. He felt uneasy and embarrassed, as if he were a schoolboy going to school himself. The pavement was so short, and as again and again he retraced his footsteps, he compared himself to a dog on a chain. For a moment he had a wild thought of taking a wider range, a very much wider range, for if he went straight on he would come to Lilion's, and he remembered the spring morning when that very pavement had led him away from society, which he detested, into liberty, nature, and slavery. It struck 9. He stood in the corridor. The schoolroom doors were closed. In the twilight he saw a long row of children's garments hanging against the wall. Hats, boas, bonnets, wraps, gloves and muffs were lying on the tables and window-sills, and whole regiments of buttoned boots and overshoes stood on the floor. But there was no smell of damp clothes and wet leather as in the halls of the parliamentary buildings and in the Working Men's Union Phoenix. Or he became conscious of a faint odour of newly mown hay. It seemed to come from a little muff lined with blue silk and trimmed with tassels, which looked like a white kitten with black dots. He could not resist taking it in his hand and smelling the perfume, new-mown hay, when the front door opened and a little girl of about 10 came in, accompanied by a maid. She looked at the master with big fearless eyes and dropped a coquettish little curtsy. The almost embarrassed master replied with a bow, which made the little beauty smile, and the maid too. She was late, but she was quite unconcerned, and allowed her maid to take off her outdoor garments and overshoes as calmly as if she had come to a dance. From the classroom came a sound which made his heart beat. What was it? Ah, the organ, the old organ. A legion of children's voices were singing Jesus at the day's beginning. He felt ill at ease, and forced himself to fix his mind on Borg and Isaac in order to control his feelings. But matters went from bad to worse. Our Father, which art in heaven. The old prayer. It was long ago. The silence was so profound that he could hear the raising of all the little heads and the rustling of collars and pinafores. The doors were thrown open. He looked at a huge, moving flower bed composed of little girls between 8 and 14. He felt self-conscious like a thief caught in the act, when the old headmistress shook hands with him. The flowers waved to and fro, and there was much excited whispering and exchanging of significant glances. He sat down at the end of a long table, surrounded by 20 fresh faces with sparkling eyes, 20 children who had never experienced the bitterest of all sorrows, the humiliations of poverty. They met his glance boldly and inquisitively, but he was embarrassed and had to pull himself together with an effort. Before long, however, he was on friendly terms with Anna and Charlotte, Georgina and Lizzie and Harry. Teaching was a pleasure. He made allowances, and let Louis XIV and Alexander be termed great men, like all others who had been successful. He permitted the French Revolution to be called a terrible event, during which the noble Louis XVI and the virtuous Marie Antoinette perished miserably, and so on. When he entered the office of the Board of Purveyance of Hay for the cavalry regiments, he felt young and refreshed. He stayed till 11 reading the Conservative. Then he went to the offices of the Committee on Brandy Distilleries, lunched and wrote 2 letters, one to Borg and one to Struve. On the stroke of 1 he was in the Department for Death Duties. Here he collated an assessment of property which brought him in 100 crowns. He had time enough before dinner to read the proofs of the revised edition of the Forest Laws, which he was editing. It struck 3. Anybody crossing the Ritterhus market at the time could have met on the bridge a young, important-looking man with pockets bulging with manuscripts and hands crossed on his back. He is strolling slowly along, accompanied by an elderly, lean, grey-haired man of 50, the actuary of the dead. The estate of every citizen who dies has to be declared to him. According to the amount, he takes his percentage. Some say that this is his duty, others that he represents the earth, and has to watch that the dead take nothing away with them, as everything is a loan, without interest. In any case, he is a man more interested in the dead than the living, and therefore Falk likes his company. He, on the other hand, is attached to Falk because, like himself, he collects coins and autographs, and because he possesses that excellent quality, tolerance, which is rarely found in a young man. The two friends enter the restaurant Rosengren, where they are fairly certain not to meet young men and where they can discuss numismatics and autography. They take their coffee in the Café Rydberg and look at catalogues of coins until 6. At 6 o'clock the official Post appears, and they read the promotions. Each enjoys the other's company, for they never quarrel. Falk is so free from fixed opinions that he is the most amiable man in the world, liked and appreciated by chiefs and colleagues. Occasionally they dine in the Hamburg Exchange and take a liqueur or two at the Opera restaurant, and to see them walking along arm in arm at 11 o'clock is really quite an edifying sight. Moreover, Falk has become a regular guest at family dinners and suppers in houses into which Borg's father has introduced him. The women find him interesting, although they do not know how to take him. He is always smiling and expert at sarcastic little pleasantries. But when he is sick of family life and the social life, he visits the Red Room, and there he meets the redoubtable Borg, his admirer Isaac, his secret enemy and envier Struve, the man who never has any money, and the sarcastic Sellén, who is gradually preparing his second success after all his imitators have accustomed the public to his manner. Lundell, who after the completion of his altarpiece gave up painting sacred pictures and became a fat Epicurean, only comes to the Red Room when he has no money to pay for his dinner. He makes a living by portrait painting, a profession which brings him countless invitations for dinners and suppers. Lundell maintains that these invitations are essential for making character studies. Olle, who is still employed by the stonemason, has become a gloomy misanthrope after his great failure as a politician and orator. He refuses to impose on his former friends and lives a solitary life. Falk is in a boisterous, riotous mood whenever he visits the Red Room, and Borg is of the opinion that he does him credit. He is a veritable sapeur to whom nothing is sacred except politics. This is a subject on which he never touches. But if, while he lets off his fireworks for the amusement of his friends, he should catch, through the dense tobacco smoke, a glimpse of the morose Olle on the other side of the room, his mood changes. He becomes gloomy like a night on the sea, and swallows large quantities of strong liquor, as if he wanted to extinguish a smouldering fire. But Olle has not been seen for a long time. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of The Red Room by August Strindberg. Translated by L. A. Schlesner. Recording by William Peck. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28 From Beyond the Grave. The snow was falling lightly and silently, clothing the street in pure white, as Falk and Sellén were walking to the infirmary in the southeastern suburb of Kingsholm to call for Borg on their way to the Red Room. "It's strange that the first snow should create an almost solemn impression," said Sellén. "The dirty ground is transformed to—" "Are you sentimental?" scoffed Falk. "Oh, no, I was merely talking from the point of view of a landscape painter." They continued their way in silence, wading through the whirling snow. "The Kingsholm, with its infirmaries, always strikes me as uncanny," remarked Falk after a pause. "Are you sentimental?" scoffed Sellén. "Not at all, but this part of the town always makes that impression on me." "Nonsense! It doesn't make any impression at all. You imagine it does. Here we are, and Borg's windows are lit up. Perhaps he's got some nice corpses tonight." They were standing before the door of the Institute. The huge building with its many dark windows glared at them as if it were inquiring what they wanted at that hour of the night. They passed the round flower bed and entered a small building on the right. At the very back of the room, Borg was sitting alone in the lamplight, working at the mutilated body of a man who had hanged himself.
Good evening,
said Borg, laying aside his knife.
Will you like to see an old friend?
He did not wait for the answer, which was not forthcoming, but lighted a lantern, took his overcoat and a bunch of keys. I didn't know that we had any friends here, said Sellén, desperately clinging to a flippant mood.
Come along,
said Borg. They crossed the yard and entered a large building. The creaking door closed behind them, and the little piece of candle, a remnant from the last card party, threw its red, feeble glimmer on the white walls. The two strangers tried to read Borg's face, wondering whether he was up to some trick, but the face was inscrutable. They turned to the left and went along a passage which echoed to their footsteps in a way which suggested that they were being followed. Falk kept close behind Borg and tried to keep Sellén at his back.
Over there,
said Borg, standing still in the middle of the passage. Nobody could see anything but walls, but they heard a low trickling sound, like the falling of a gentle rain, and became aware of a strange odour resembling the smell of a damp flower-bed or a pine-wood in October.
To the right,
said Borg. The right wall was made of glass, and behind it, on their backs, lay three white bodies. Borg selected a key, opened the glass door, and entered.
Here,
he said, standing still before the second of the three. It was Olle. He lay there as quietly, with his hands folded across his chest, as if he were taking an afternoon nap. His drawn-up lips created the impression that he was smiling. He was well preserved. "Drowned?" asked Sellén, who was the first to regain his self-possession.
Drowned? Echoed Borg. Can either of you identify his clothes?
Three miserable suits were hanging against the wall. Sellén at once picked out the right one, a blue jacket with sporting buttons, and a pair of black trousers, rubbed white at the knees.
Are you certain?
Ought to know my own coat, which I borrowed from Falk. Sellén drew a pocket-book from the breast pocket of the jacket. It was saturated with water and covered with green algae, which Borg called enteromorph. He opened it by the light of the lantern and examined its contents. 2 or 3 overdue pawn tickets and a bundle of papers tied together, on which was written, "To him who cares to read."
Have you seen enough?
asked Borg.
Then let's go and have a drink.
The three mourners, friend was a word only used by Levin and Lundell when they wanted to borrow money, went to the nearest public-house as representatives of the Red Room. Beside a blazing fire and behind a battery of bottles, Borg began the perusal of the papers which Olle had left behind. But more than once he had to have recourse to Falk's skill as an autographer, for the water had washed away the words here and there. It looked as if the writer's tears had fallen on the sheets, as Sellén facetiously remarked.
Stop talking now,
said Borg, emptying his glass of grog with a grimace which exhibited all his back teeth.
I am going to read, and I beg of you not to interrupt me. To him who cares to read. I have a right to take my life, all the more so because not only does my act not interfere with the interests of a fellow creature, but rather it contributes to the happiness, as it is called, of at least one person. A place and 400 cubic feet of air will become vacant. My motive is not despair, for an intelligent individual never despairs, but I take this step with a fairly calm conscience. That an act of this kind throws one's mind into a certain state of excitement will be easily understood by everybody. To postpone it from fear of what might come hereafter is only worthy of a slave clutching at any excuse, so that he might stay in a world where he cannot have suffered much. At the thought of going, a burden seems to fall from my shoulders. I cannot fare worse, I might fare better. If there is no life beyond the grave, death must be happiness. As great a happiness, at least, as sleep in a soft bed after hard physical labour. Nobody who has ever observed how sleep relaxes every muscle, and how the soul gradually steals away, can fear death. Why does humanity make so much ado about death? Because it has burrowed so deeply into the earth, that a tearing away from it is bound to be painful. I put off from the shore long ago. I have no family bonds, no social, national, or legal ties which could hold me back, and I am going simply because life has no longer any attraction for me. I do not want to encourage those who are well content to follow my example. They have no reason to do so, and therefore they cannot judge my act. I have not considered the point whether it is cowardly or not. To that aspect of the question I am indifferent. Moreover, it is a private matter. I never asked to come here, and therefore I have a right to go when I please. My reason for going? There are so many reasons, and they are so complicated that I have neither the time nor the ability to explain them. I will only mention the most obvious, those which had the greatest influence on myself and on my act. My childhood and youth were one long continuation of manual labor. You who do not know what it means to labor from sunrise to sunset, only to fall into a heavy sleep when the toil is over, you have escaped the curse of the fall, for it is a curse to feel one's spiritual growth arrested, while one's body sinks deeper and deeper into the earth. A man who walks behind the ploughing cattle day in and day out, and sees nothing but the grey clouds, will end by forgetting the blue sky above his head. A man who takes a spade and digs a hole while the sun scorches his skin, will feel that he is sinking into the parched ground and digging a grave for his soul. You know nothing of this, you who play all day long and work a little only during an idle hour between luncheon and dinner, you who rest your spirit when the earth is green and enjoy nature as an ennobling and elevating spectacle. The toiler on the land never sees the spirit of nature. To him the field is bread, the forest timber, the sea a washtub, the meadow cheese and milk. Everything is earth, soulless earth. When I saw one half of humanity engaged in fostering their spiritual growth, while the other half had merely time to attend to their bodily needs, I thought at first that there existed two laws for two different species of man. But my intellect denied this, my spirit rebelled, and I resolved that I too would escape the curse of the fall. I became an artist. I can analyze the much talked of artistic instinct because I was endowed with it myself. It rests on a broad base of longing for freedom, freedom from profitable labor. For this reason, a German philosopher defined beauty as the unprofitable. As soon as a work of art is of practical use, betrays a purpose or a tendency, its beauty vanishes. Furthermore, the instinct rests on pride. Man wants to play God in art, not that he wants to create anything new, he can't do that, but because he wants to improve, to arrange, to recreate. He does not begin by admiring his model, nature, but by criticizing it. Everything is full of faults, and he longs to correct them. This pride, spurring a man on to never-ceasing effort, and the freedom from work, the curse of the fall, beget in the artist the illusion that he is standing above his fellow creatures. To a certain extent this is true, but unless he were constantly recalling this fact, he would find himself out, that is to say, find the unreal in his activity and the unjustifiable in his escape from the profitable. This constant need of appreciation of his unprofitable work makes him vain, restless, and often deeply unhappy. As soon as he comes to a clear understanding of himself, he becomes unproductive and goes under, for only the religious mind can return to slavery after having once tasted freedom. To differentiate between genius and talent, to look upon genius as a separate quality, is nonsense, and argues a faith in special manifestation. The great artist is endowed with a certain amount of ability to acquire some kind of technical skill. Without practice, his ability dies. Somebody has said, genius is the infinite capacity for taking pains. That is, like so many other things, a half-truth. If culture be added, a rare thing because knowledge makes all things clear, and the cultured man therefore rarely becomes an artist, and a sound intellect, the result is genius, the natural product of a combination of favorable circumstances. I soon lost faith in the sublime character of my hobby. Heaven forbid that I should call it by profession, for my art was incapable of expressing a single idea. At the most it could represent the body in a position expressing an emotion, accompanying a thought, or, in other words, express a thought at third hand. It is like signaling, meaningless to all who cannot read the signals. I only see a red flag, but the soldier sees the word of command, advance. After all, even Plato, who was a fine intellectualist and an idealist into the bargain, realized the futility of art, calling it but the semblance of a semblance, reality. Wherefore he excluded the artist from his ideal state. He was in earnest. I tried to find my way back into slavery, but I could not. I tried to find it in my most sacred duty. I tried to resign myself, but I did not succeed. My soul was taking harm, and I was on the way to becoming a beast. There were times when I fancied that all this toil was a positive sin, in as far as it checked the greater aim of spiritual development. At such times I played truant for a day and fled to nature, absorbed in unspeakably blissful meditations. But then again this bliss appeared to me in the light of a selfish pleasure as great, greater even than the pleasure I used to feel in my artistic work. Conscience, the sense of duty, overtook me like a fury and drove me back to my yoke, which then seemed beautiful for a day. To escape from this unbearable state of mind and win light and peace, I go to face the unknown. You who behold my dead body say, do I look unhappy in death? Notes made while walking. The plan of the world is the deliverance of the idea from the form. Art, on the other hand, attempts to imprison the idea in a sensuous form, so as to make it visible. Therefore, everything corrects itself. When artistic traffic in Florence surpassed all bounds, Savonarola came, the profound thinker, and spoke his "All this is futile," and the artists, and what artists they were, made a pyre of their masterpieces. O Savonarola! What was the object of the iconoclasts in Constantinople? What did the Baptists and the breakers of images want in the Netherlands? I dare not state it for fear of being branded. The great striving of our time, division of labour, benefits the species, but sentences the individual to death. What is the species? The conception of the whole. The philosophers call it the idea, and the individuals believe what they say and lay down their lives for the idea. It is a strange thing that the will of the princes and the will of the people always clashes. Isn't there a very simple and easy remedy? When at the riper age I again read through my school books, I was astonished to find that we human beings are so little removed from the beasts in the fields. I reread Luther's catechism in those days. I made a few annotations and drafted a plan for a new catechism, not to be sent in to the commissioners. What I am going to say now is all that I have written. The first commandment destroys the doctrine of one God, for it assumes other gods, an assumption granted by Christianity. Note, monotheism, which is so highly extolled, has had an adverse influence on humanity. It has robbed it of love and respect for the one and true God, by leaving evil unexplained. The second and third commandments are blasphemous. The author puts petty and stupid commands in the mouth of the Lord, commands which are an insult to His omniscience. If the author were living in our days, a charge of blasphemy would be brought against him. The fifth commandment should read as follows: Your inbred feeling of respect for your parents shall not induce you to admire their faults. You shall not honor them beyond their deserts. Under no circumstances do you owe your parents any gratitude. They have not done you a service by bringing you into this world. Selfishness and the civil code of laws compel them to clothe and feed you. The parents who expect gratitude from their children, there are some who even demand it, are like usurers. They are willing to risk the capital as long as the interest is being paid. Note 1. The reason why parents, more especially fathers, hate their children so much more frequently than they love them arises from the fact that the presence of children has an adverse influence on the financial position of the parents. There are parents who treat their children as if they were shares in a joint stock company, from which they expect constant dividends. Number 2. This commandment has resulted in the most terrible of all forms of government, in the tyranny of the family, from which no revolution can deliver us. There is more need for the foundation of societies for the protection of children than for societies for the protection of animals. To be continued. Sweden is a colony which has passed her prime, the period when she was a great power, and like Greece, Italy, and Spain, she is now sinking into eternal sleep. The terrible reaction which set in after 1865, the year of the death of all hope, has had a demoralizing effect on the new generation. History has not witnessed for a long time a greater indifference to the general welfare, a greater selfishness, a greater irreligiousness. In the world outside, the nations are bellowing with fury against oppression, but in Sweden all we do is to celebrate jubilees. Pietism is the sole sign of spiritual life of the sleeping nation. It is the discontent which has thrown itself into the arms of resignation to avoid despair and impotent fury. Pietists and pessimists start with the same principle, the misery of the world, and have the same aim, to die to the world and live to God. The greatest sin man can commit is to be a conservative from selfish motives. It is an attempt against the plan of the world for the sake of a few shillings. The conservative tries to stem evolution. He plants his back against the rolling earth and says, "Stand still." There is but one excuse, stupidity. Poor circumstances are no excuse, merely an explanation. I wonder whether Norway is not going to prove a new patch on an old garment, as far as we are concerned." "Well, what do you think of it?" asked Borg, laying down the papers and drinking a small brandy.
"Not bad," said Sellén. "It might have been expressed more wittily."
"What do you think, Falk?"
"The usual cry. Nothing more. Shall we go now?" Borg looked at him, wondering whether he was speaking ironically, but he saw no danger signal in Falk's face. "And so Olle has gone to happier hunting grounds," said Sellén. "He's well off. Need no longer trouble about his dinner. I wonder what the head waiter at the Brass Button will say to it. Olle owed him a little money." "What heartlessness! What brutality! Shame on you!" burst out Falk, throwing a few coins on the table and putting on his overcoat. "Are you sentimental?" scoffed Sellén. "Yes, I am. Good night." And he had gone. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Red Room by August Strindberg. Translated by Ellie Schlesinger. Recording by William Peck. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. Revue.
Licentiate Borg at Stockholm to the landscape painter Sellén at Paris. Dear Sellén, you have waited a whole year for a letter from me. Now I have news to tell you. If I were acting on my principles, I should begin with myself. But as I had better conform to the rules of politeness laid down by civilized society, seeing that I am about to go out into the world to earn my own living, I will begin with you. I heartily congratulate you on the success of your recently exhibited picture. Isaac took the notice to the Grey Bonnet, and it was printed without the knowledge of the editor, who was furious when he read it. He had firmly made up his mind that you should be a failure. But now that your genius has been acknowledged abroad, you are famous at home too, and I need no longer be ashamed of you. In order to forget nothing, and to be as brief as possible, for I am lazy as well as tired after a day's work at the hospital, I will write my letter in the shape of a report, and the style of the Grey Bonnet. This will have the additional advantage that you can more easily skip those parts which do not interest you. The political situation is becoming more and more interesting. All parties have corrupted one another by presents and counter-presents, and now all of them are grey. This reaction will probably end in socialism. There is a talk of increasing the number of districts to 48, and the ministerial career is the one which offers the best chances of promotion, more especially as a man need not even have passed the examination of an elementary school teacher. I met a school friend the other day who is already a pension cabinet minister. He told me that it was far easier to become a minister than a secretary of one of the departments. They say the work is very much like the work of a man who signs guarantees. It is only a matter of a signature now and then. It doesn't matter so much about the payment, there is always a second guarantor. The press, well, you know the press. Roughly speaking, it is just business. That is to say, it always adopts the opinion of the majority, and the majority, or in other words the greater number of subscribers, is reactionary. One day I asked a liberal journalist how it was that he wrote in such laudatory terms about you, of whom he knew nothing. He said it was because public opinion, i.e., the largest number of subscribers, was on your side. But supposing public opinion turned against him, I asked. Then, of course, he said, I shall turn against him too. You will understand that under these circumstances the whole generation, which grew up after 1865, and which is not represented in Parliament, is in despair. And therefore they are either nihilists, in other words, they don't care a d for anything, or they find their advantage in turning conservative. To be a liberal in these days is the devil's own job. The financial position is depressed. The supply of bills, mine at least, reduced. No bank will look at the safest bills, even if they are signed by 2 doctors. The Triton went into liquidation, as you know. Directors and liquidators took over the printed shares. But the shareholders and depositors received a number of lithographed ones from the well-known society at Norrköping, which alone managed to weather this period of frauds and swindles. I met a widow who had a handful of papers connected with a marble quarry. They were large, beautiful sheets, printed in red and blue, on which 1000 cr. 1000 cr. was engraved. and below the figures, just as if they were standing security, appeared the names of well-known persons. 3 of them at least are Knights of the Order of the Seraphim. Nicholas Falk, the friend and brother, sick of his private money-lending business, because it detracted from the full value of his civic authority, which is far from being the case when the business is a public one, decided to combine with a few experts, and have found a bank. The novel feature of the undertaking was expressed as follows. As experience, truly a melancholy experience, Levin is the author, as you may guess, has proved that deposit receipts are not in themselves a sufficient guarantee for the return of deposits, that is, deposited money, we, the undersigned, actuated by unselfish zeal for the welfare of home industry and desirous of giving greater security to the well-to-do public, have founded a bank under the title of Deposit Guarantee Society Limited. The novel and safe feature of the enterprise, and not everything new is safe, consists in the fact that the depositors, instead of receiving deposit receipts, are given securities to the full value of the deposited sums, etc., etc. They do a brisk business, and you may imagine what sort of securities they issue instead of deposit receipts. Levin. Falk, with his keen eye for business, recognized at once the great advantage to be reaped from the services of a man with Levin's experience and colossal knowledge of people, acquired through his money-lending business. But to train him for all eventualities and make him familiar with all the byways of the business, he felled him to the ground with his promissory note and forced him into bankruptcy. Having done so, he appeared in the role of his saviour and made him his confidential clerk with the title of secretary. And now Levin is installed in a little private office, but on no account is he permitted to show his face in the bank. Isaac Levi is employed in the same bank as cashier. He passes examinations, with Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, first class in all subjects. The Grey Bonnet, of course, reported his achievements. Now he is reading for the law and doing a little business on his own account. He is like the eel. He has 9 lives and lives on nothing. He takes no alcohol. He does not smoke. I don't know whether he has any vices, but he is formidable. He has an ironmonger's shop at Hernösand, a tobacconist's at Helsingfors, and a fancy goods shop at Södertälje. In addition, he owns a few cottages at Stockholm. Some people say he is the coming man. I say the man has come. After the winding up of the Triton, his brother retired with a considerable fortune, I am told, and is now doing business privately. I heard that he proposed buying the forest monastery near Uppsala and rebuilding it in a new style invented by his uncle at the Academy of Arts. But his offer was refused. Levi, very much offended, sent a notice to the Grey Bonnet under the heading Persecution of the Jews in the 19th Century. It won him the lively sympathy of the whole cultured public. The affair would win him a seat in Parliament, if he cared for that distinction. A vote of thanks was presented to him by his co-religionists, as if Levi had any religion, which was printed in the Grey Bonnet. They thanked him for standing up for the rights of the Jews, to buy the forest monastery. The address was handed to him at a banquet, to which also a great many Swedes, I always refer the Jewish question to its rightful domain, the ethnographical one, had been hidden, to feast on bad salmon and uncorked wine. The deeply moved hero of the day, Vide Grey Bonnet, received on the same occasion a present of 20,000 crowns in shares for the foundation of a home for fallen boys of the evangelical denomination. I was present at the banquet and saw a sight I had never seen before. I saw Isaac the worse for drink. He shouted that he hated me and you and Falk and all whites. He alternately called us whites and natives and roach. I had never heard the last word before, but no sooner had he uttered it than a large number of blacks crowded around us, looking so ominous that Isaac thought it better to take me into an adjoining room. There he poured out his soul to me. He spoke of his sufferings as a schoolboy, of the ill treatment to which master and schoolfellows had subjected him, the daily knocks and cuffs from the street Arabs. But what roused my indignation more than anything else was an incident which had happened to him during his military service. He was called up to the front at vespers and ordered to recite the Lord's Prayer. As he did not know it, he was scoffed and jeered at. His account made me change my opinion of him and his race. Religious swindle and charitable fraud are more rampant than ever and make life in our country very unpleasant. You will remember 2 imps of Satan, Mrs. Falk and Mrs. Homan, the two pettiest, vainest, and most malicious creatures who ever idled away their days. You know the crèche they had founded and its end. Their latest achievement is a home for fallen women, and the first inmate, received on my recommendation, was Marie. The poor girl had lent all her savings to a fellow who absconded with them. She was only too happy to find a home where she would be kept free of charge, and be able to retrieve her character. She told me that she did not mind all the religious palaver, which is, unfortunately, inseparable from an enterprise of this sort, as long as she could count on her cup of coffee in the morning. The Reverend Scory, whom you will no doubt remember, has not been made pastor primarius, and from sheer annoyance he is begging for funds to build a new church. Printed begging letters, signed by all the wealthiest magnates of Sweden, are sent out to appeal to the charitable public. The church, which is to be 3 times the size of the church on the Blasieholm, and connected with a sky-high tower, is to be built on the old site of St. Catherine's. The latter is supposed to be too small to satisfy the great spiritual needs from which the Swedish nation is suffering at the moment, and is, therefore, to be pulled down. The sum collected has already reached such dimensions that a treasurer had to be appointed, with free lodging and fuel. Who do you think is a treasurer? You would never guess. Struve. Struve has become somewhat religious these days. I say somewhat, because it is not much, only just enough for his position, for he is patronized by the faithful. This does, however, not interfere with his journalism and his drinking. But his heart is not soft. On the contrary, he is most bitter against all those who have not come down. Between you and me, he has very much deteriorated. Therefore he hates you and Falk, and he has sworn to slate you the next time you are heard of. He had to submit to the marriage ceremony for the sake of the free lodging and fuel. He was married to his wife in the White Mountains. I was one of the witnesses. His wife, too, has been converted, for she is under the impression that religion is good form. Lundell has left the religious sphere, and is painting nothing but portraits of directors. He has been made assistant at the Academy of Arts. He has also become immortal, for he has managed to smuggle a painting of his into the National Museum. It was accomplished by a very simple trick, and ought to encourage imitators. Smith made a present to the National Museum of one of Lundell's genre pictures, a service which Lundell repaid by painting his portrait gratis. Splendid, isn't it? The end of a romance. One Sunday morning, at the hour when the Sabbath peace is not disturbed by the terrible church bells, I was sitting in my room smoking. There was a knock at the door, and a tall, well-made man, whose face seemed familiar to me, entered. It was Rehnhjelm. We cross-examined each other. He is manager of a large factory, and quite satisfied with his lot. Presently there was another knock. It was Falk. More of him later on. We revived old memories and discussed mutual friends. But by and by there was a pause, that strange silence which so frequently occurs after a lively conversation. Rehnhjelm took up a book, turned over the leaves, and read out A Caesarean Operation, an academic treatise, which, with the permission of the illustrious medical faculty, will be publicly discussed in the little lecture room of the university. What horrible diagrams! Who in the world is the unfortunate being cursed thus to haunt the living after his death? You will find it on page 2, I said. He went on reading. The pelvis, which, as number 38, is preserved in the pathological collection of the Academy. No, that can't be it. Agnes Rundgren, spinster. The man's face turned as white as chalk. He got up and drank some water. Do you know the woman? I asked, in order to distract his thoughts. Did I know her? She was on the stage, and I knew her at X-Kopping. After leaving X-Kopping, she was engaged in a Stockholm café, under the name of Beda Patterson. Then you should have seen Falk. It came to a scene which ended in Rehnhjelm's cursing all women, and Falk, greatly excited, replying that there were 2 kinds of women, which differed from each other as much as angels and devils. He was so moved that Rehnhjelm's eyes filled with tears. And now to Falk. I purposely left him to the last. He is engaged to be married. How did it happen? He himself says, we just met one another. As you know, I have no rigid opinions, but cultivate an open mind. But from what I have seen up to now, it is undeniable that love is something of which we bachelors know nothing. What we call love is nothing but frivolity. You may laugh, if you like, you old scoffer. Only in very bad plays have I seen such a rapid development of character as I had occasion to watch in Falk. You won't be surprised to hear that his engagement was not all plain sailing. The girl's father, an old widower, a selfish army pensioner, looked upon his daughter as an investment, hoping that she would marry well and thereby secure him a comfortable old age. Nothing at all unusual. He therefore bluntly refused his consent. You should have seen Falk. He called on the old man again and again. He was kicked out and yet called again, and told the old egoist to the face that he would marry his daughter without his consent, if he continued to object. I am not sure, but I believe it actually came to fisticuffs. One evening Falk had accompanied his sweetheart home. They had both spent the evening at the house of one of the girl's relatives to whom Falk had introduced himself. When they turned the corner of the street in which the girl lives, they saw by the light of the street lamp that her father was leaning out of the window. He lives in a small house which belongs to him. Falk knocked at the garden gate, but nobody came to open it. At last he climbed over and was on the other side attacked by a large dog. He got the better of the brute and shut it up in the dustbin. Imagine the nervous Falk. Then he compelled the porter to get up and open the gate. Now they had gained the yard and stood before the front door. He hammered it with a large stone, but no reply came from within. He searched the garden and found a ladder, by means of which he reached the old man's window. "Open the door," he shouted, "or I'll smash the window." "If you smash the window, you rascal," yelled the old man, "I'll shoot you." Falk immediately smashed the window. For a few moments there was silence. Finally a voice came from within the fortress. "You are my man. I consent." "I'm not fond of smashing windows," explained Falk, "but there's nothing I would not do to win your daughter." The matter was settled, and they became engaged. I don't know whether you know that Parliament has carried through its reorganization of the public offices, doubling the salaries and the number of posts, so that a young man in the first division is now in a position to marry. Falk is going to be married in the autumn. His wife will keep her post at the school. I know next to nothing of the woman's question, it doesn't interest me, but I believe that our generation will get rid of the last remnant of the Eastern conception which still clings to marriage. In the days to come, husband and wife will enter into a partnership where both will retain their independence. They will not try to convert each other, but will mutually respect their weaknesses and live together in a lifelong friendship which will never be strained by the demands of one of the partners for amorous demonstrations. I look upon Mrs. Nicholas Falk, the charitable she-devil, as nothing more than a femme entretenue, and I am sure she does so herself. Most women marry for a home where they need not work, be their own mistress, as it is called. The fact that marriage is on a decline is as much the woman's fault as the man's. But I cannot make Falk out. He is studying numismatics with an almost unnatural zeal. He told me the other day that he was engaged in writing a textbook on numismatics, which he would endeavour to introduce into the schools where this science is to be taught. He never reads a paper. He does not know what is going on in the world, and he seems to have abandoned the idea of writing. He lives only for his work and his fiancée, whom he worships. But I don't trust his calm. Falk is a political fanatic, well aware that he would be consumed if he allowed the fire to burn freely. Therefore he tries to stifle it with hard, monotonous work. But I don't think that he will succeed. In spite of all his restraint, the day is bound to come when he will cast aside all self-control and burst out into fresh flames. Between you and me, I believe he belongs to one of those secret societies which are responsible for the reaction and militarism on the continent. Not very long ago, at the reading of the King's speech in Parliament, I saw him, dressed in a purple cloak, with a feather in his hat, sitting at the foot of the throne, and I thought, no, it would be a sin to say what I thought. But when the Prime Minister read His Majesty's gracious propositions respecting the state of the country and its needs, I saw a look in Falk's eyes which plainly said, "What on earth does His Majesty know of the condition and needs of the country? That man, oh, that man!" I conclude my review without having forgotten anybody. Enough for today. You shall soon hear from me again. H. B. 1879. End of chapter 29.
Chapter 30 of The Red Room by August Strindberg. Translated by Ellie Schlesinger. Recording by William Peck.
This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30. Epilogue.
Doubtless there is not another street in Stockholm as ugly, and not another house as old, as dirty, and as gloomy. The entrance gate has the inviting appearance of a disused gallows. The rubble stones in the yard have moved more closely together in the course of time, so that a few small blades of grass have been able to shoot up. The house stands by itself, like an old hermit who has sought a solitary spot in which to collapse. There has once been an assaying office in the yard, and the outside walls are blackened with smoke. The chinks between the window frames and the walls are grown over, and the house looks as if it had not washed its face or eyes for a generation. The foundation has settled, and the building is stooping to the left. The leaking gutter has been weeping tears which have drawn black furrows all over the front of the building. The plastering is crumbling off here and there, and on windy nights one can hear it rattling down the walls into the street below. The house looks like an old dowager house of poverty, recklessness, carelessness, and vice. And yet there are two people who cannot pass through the street without stopping to look at the miserable, frowning old building with emotion almost amounting to love. To them the entrance gate is a triumphal arch, the weeds and the gutter a green meadow, and a murmuring brook, the black house a charming ruin, containing lovely, rose-red memories. It is more, even, for whenever they pass it, the air vibrates with music, perfumes rise from the earth, and they see the sun shining, even on the cloudiest autumn day. There have been times when they forgot themselves so far as to kiss each other, but they have always been a little mad, these good people. 3 years ago, our good friend, we might call him friend, since he repented of his youthful errors, apologized to society, and became a respectable individual, serving the country and wearing purple in the House of Parliament. Our young friend, I say, was busy on the third floor of the ugly old house with a sheet of pens between his lips, a hammer in his coat pocket, and a pair of pincers under his arm. He was standing on a ladder, putting up curtains in a small room, furnished only with a tiny sofa, a tiny dressing-table, a small desk, and a very small bed with white curtains. In the dining-room the faithful Isaac, in shirt-sleeves, was engaged in spreading paste on a piece of wallpaper, stretched on an ironing-board which rested on 2 chairs. He was whistling and singing one unknown song after another to quite unheard-of tunes. When he was tired of working, he prepared luncheon on an empty box standing before the window. Outside, the sun was shining into the neighbour's garden. It was a tiny garden, squeezed between the walls of the houses. It had a pear tree in full bloom, and 2 elder bushes covered with blossoms. Between the gables a piece of blue sky was visible, and the mastheads of the timber barges in the harbour. Isaac had been to the dairy, had bought sandwiches and porter, had papered the future mistress's room, had purchased oleanders and ivy, so that the landing windows with their black frames should not shock the young wife as she entered her new home. He would have liked to paint them, but he was afraid that she might object to the smell. A cab stopped before the front door. "It's Borg," said Isaac. "What the dickens does he want here? And that pest Levin is with him." It was a long visit, lasting 10 minutes, and a disagreeable one, but Falk bore it patiently, like any other trial. He had forever broken with the past, in one respect at least, in another he was bound, for he had been compelled during the 10 minutes to sign once more. The next visitors were the sister-in-law, Mrs. Falk, and Mrs. Homan. They found the paper in the dining-room too dark, and the paper in the young wife's room too light. They thought the curtains in the husband's room were not wide enough, the carpet a bad match to the furniture, the clock old-fashioned, and the chandelier too dear for its plainness. One piece of furniture in the young wife's room especially roused their critical faculty, and gave rise to a long, whispered conversation. They called the kitchen black, the landing dirty, the entrance terrible, but otherwise they said everything was quite nice, much nicer than the yard, where there was not even a porter, led one to expect. This was the second plague, and it passed like everything else in this world.
But Isaac had lost some of his gaiety after the criticism of his wallpapers, and Falk realized for a moment that it was a miserable hole. He opened the windows to let out the evil spirits which had invaded his pleasure garden. Isaac declared that during the wedding days he would have the two women shut up in the debtors' prison, so as to keep them safely away. And then she came. He was standing at the window, and he saw her when she was still too far off to be seen. He expected to be believed when he maintained that she radiated light and that the street through which she was walking was bathed in sunshine. Of course, he could have told endless stories of her kindness, sweetness, and beauty, but not even she believed them, and it is not worth while repeating them. She entered her future home and found everything charming. Isaac went into the kitchen to split some wood and light the kitchen fire. Nobody missed him until he returned with a tray bearing some cups of chocolate. It amused him. He knew that lovers never miss anybody in the wide world, and he found the terrible selfishness which is called love a very amiable quality. Moreover, everybody admits that it is justified. What people said about it, they said. Well, and so Falk is married? Is he? Whom did he marry? A schoolmistress? Ugh! A woman with blue spectacles and short hair? And the questioner had all the information he wanted. If the answer had been, he's married old Cockstrom's daughter, the second question would have been, did he get any money with her? The world asks no further questions, and everything would be all right, if this were all. But the world demands that a couple which has 3 times given the clergyman the trouble to read the banns and the community to listen to them, which has forced its fellow creatures to engage in genealogical research and send a reporter to the wedding, the world demands that such a couple shall be happy. Woe to it if it is not. Supposing that on coming home from school, tired with her work, angry at a slight, depressed because some of her efforts have proved a failure, she should meet a friend in the street who takes her hand and says, "You don't look too happy, Elizabeth," then woe to him. Suppose that on leaving his office, in despair, because he has been overlooked instead of promoted, he should meet a friend who finds him looking depressed, then woe to her. Unhappy people, if you dare to be anything but happy. It was a winter evening 2 or 3 years later. She was bending over her writing desk, correcting copybooks. He was sitting in his room computing assessments of property. The pens were scribbling, the clock was ticking, and the tea kettle singing. Whenever he looked up from his documents at her sweet face, she raised her eyes. Their glances met, and they nodded to each other as if they had been parted for a long time, and they continued working, but finally he grew tired of his work. "Talk to me a little," he pleaded, and she eagerly complied with his request. But what do they talk about? The scoffer Borg once asked that question, when he declared matrimony to be an impossibility from the point of view of natural science. He laid down the proposition that the moment must come when every subject had been discussed, when each partner knew every thought and opinion of the other, and when absolute silence was bound to reign. The fool. End of chapter 30. End of the Red Room, by August Strindberg, translated by Ellie Schlesinger. Recording by William Peck.